I felt something strange the first day I set foot in this building. The walls had cracks running from floor to ceiling, and the paint looked faded. The lobby smelled of old books and damp carpet, and the overhead light flickered when I walked in. I didn't think much of it at the time, but it stuck in my mind. I had just signed the lease on a new apartment in this old historic complex. I was looking for a place with character, and this building had a lot of it. It was built in the early 1900s, and every hallway had peeling wallpaper and creaking floorboards. It looked worn, but it had a certain charm. I never expected to find a hidden room behind an ancient wall. That discovery changed everything. I moved in on a Tuesday afternoon. My boxes lined the living room, and I was alone with the echo of my footsteps. The apartment was on the second floor. It had a long hallway leading to a small kitchen, a decent bedroom, and a cozy living area. The walls were high, and the windows overlooked a narrow side street. From the day I moved in, there was a slight draft coming from somewhere near the bedroom closet. I thought it was just the old insulation. I tried taping the edges of the closet door to block the breeze, but the draft persisted. It felt like a cold breath whenever I walked past. The following week, I decided to investigate. I emptied the closet to get a better look. I put my clothes and boxes on the bed. Then I took a small flashlight and checked every corner. The back wall looked solid, but there was a seam running vertically, like a line that separated two pieces of drywall. I pressed on it, and I heard a faint creaking sound. My heartbeat picked up a little. I tested different spots along that seam. At one point, I felt the wall shift. The bottom edge near the floor gave way slightly, creating a thin gap. I pulled a bit harder, and an entire panel slid open. My stomach dropped. I saw darkness beyond that opening. It wasn't a normal gap in the wall. It was a hidden space about the size of a small room. I pushed the closet light so that it aimed into this new area. I saw cobwebs, dusty beams, and some old crates piled in a corner. I took a few steps inside, ducking under a low beam. The ceiling was uneven, and the walls were made of crumbling plaster. The air was stale, and it smelled like something left alone for decades. My throat felt dry, and I coughed. I stood there, sweeping the flashlight around. That's when I noticed something move along the far wall. It was a shadow, but it didn't match my movements. I froze. My pulse pounded in my ears. I waited, not making a sound. I don't believe in ghosts. I never have. But that shadow moved again, sliding across the wall to the side, out of my flashlight's beam. My arms were tense, and I could feel goosebumps on my neck. I didn't move. I just stared. Then I heard a faint sound. It was like a whisper, but I couldn't make out any words. It reminded me of distant voices in an empty hallway. I exhaled, realized I was holding my breath, and tried to calm myself. I swung the flashlight around again. I didn't see anything. The shadow was gone. The next few minutes were a blur. My heart wouldn't stop racing. I took a closer look at the crates. They were covered in a thick layer of dust and had old shipping labels. One crate had a broken lid, so I pried it open with the base of my flashlight. Inside, there were some tarnished metal objects. They looked like candlesticks or stands of some kind. Another crate had stacks of old books. I tried to pick one up, but the cover crumbled in my hands. The pages seemed to have some kind of strange markings. I squinted, trying to read them. It looked like writing in a language I didn't recognize. It wasn't just Old English or Latin. It was something else. I heard another sound. It came from behind me. It was a shuffling noise. I whipped around with the flashlight, and again, I saw a flicker of movement. My legs felt weak. My mind kept telling me it was just my eyes playing tricks, but my gut told me something else was here. I backed away toward the opening in the closet, keeping the light pointed into the dark. Then I felt the floorboards under my feet creak. I thought they might give way, so I tested each step. When I reached the closet, I slid back through and stood in my bedroom. I was breathing hard. My shirt clung to my back, and I realized I was sweating. I closed the hidden panel, but it didn't sit flush anymore. There was a slight gap at the bottom. I stared at it for a while, then took a deep breath. I I felt a chill, even though it wasn't that cold in my bedroom. I walked to the living room to clear my head. The rest of the apartment was quiet. I could hear a dog barking outside on the street. I could hear a car pass by. Everything seemed normal. But that closet was about 20 feet away, and I couldn't stop thinking about those shadows. I decided to return the next day. I didn't want to rush into it that night. I slept poorly, tossing and turning, replaying those few minutes in my head. That whisper wouldn't leave me alone. I thought about the weird language in those books. I tried to push the thoughts aside, but every creak in the apartment made me jump. By morning, I was exhausted. Around noon, I got a stronger flashlight and a small crowbar, then went back to the closet. I slid the panel open again. The room beyond looked the same. Dust hung in the air, and a low draft brushed against my ankles. I switched on the flashlight, stepped inside, and began to search more thoroughly. The first crate I'd opened was just as I'd left it, with those metal objects scattered on top. The second crate held those delicate books. I tried to lift them out carefully this time. Some pages flaked right off. A few of the volumes had thicker parchment and remained intact. The covers had odd symbols drawn in a faint greenish ink. One symbol reminded me of a circle with lines cutting across it, but it wasn't a simple shape. The lines twisted in a pattern I couldn't follow. I set the books aside and opened another crate. This one had old clothing. It looked like suits, hats, gloves, and maybe some scarves. They smelled musty, like mothballs in stale air. The next crate was heavier. I pried it open to find more metal objects. They were arranged in a neat row, each wrapped in yellowed paper. One was a small box with a hinge on one side. I lifted the lid, and inside, I saw a set of keys. They were made of iron, with intricate engravings along the bow of each key. There were 3 of them in total. They felt cold in my hand, almost unnaturally so. As I examined them, I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck again. The hair there stood up. I inhaled, and my heartbeat picked up. That same faint whisper drifted through the air. It was quieter than before, but it was there. It seemed to come from behind the crates. My mouth went dry. I didn't speak. I just turned the flashlight toward the back wall where the plaster was cracked. I thought I saw movement again, a slight ripple of darkness against the wall. My grip on the flashlight tightened, and my palms started to sweat. I took a step forward. The whispering grew a little louder, though I still couldn't make out any distinct words. It reminded me of a hush, like somebody talking in the next room. I looked at the cracked plaster. Parts of it had crumbled to reveal an older layer of wood paneling underneath. There were faint markings scratched into the wood. They looked similar to the symbols on the book covers. I bent closer, running my fingers over the grooves. They felt rough, and I got a splinter in my thumb. I hissed in pain, pulled my hand back, and saw a bead of blood well up. At that moment, I felt a strange pressure in the room. It was like the air got heavier. I heard a soft rustling to my left. I turned, and my flashlight flickered. I saw a dark shape move past me and vanish into the corner. My chest tightened. I realized I was shaking. My mind felt jumbled, but I forced myself to stay calm. I wanted answers about whatever was going on here. I set the keys and the box on a nearby crate and stepped further into that corner. There were more crates stacked there, and a small table covered in a layer of dust. An old oil lamp rested on it, along with a tarnished mirror. I lifted the mirror carefully. It had cracked spiderwebbing across the glass, and I could hardly see my reflection. I set it back down, noticing the whispering had stopped. I decided to take a few items out of that secret space and examine them in better light. I grabbed one of the thicker books, the small hinged box with the keys, and one of those metal objects that looked like a candlestick. I took them into my living room and set them on the coffee table. I opened the blinds to let sunlight in. Then I tried to look at the symbols on the book. The writing was faded, but I could see rows of characters, each made up of lines and slashes. Some pages had small drawings of the building's facade. The windows and doors were labeled with inscriptions. It seemed like a strange mapping of the structure. I recognized the shape of the main entrance and the lobby layout. There were lines drawn to hidden passages or compartments. My apartment was labeled with something I couldn't read. Near that label, there was a small symbol that looked like an eye. I felt uneasy. I remembered those moving shadows. I wondered if this hidden space was some sort of storage area for the building's older residents. Maybe they hid these items for a reason. The presence in that room felt charged, like it was linked to everything in these crates. I looked at the keys again. Each key had tiny etchings of the same symbol, an eye with lines radiating around it. I ran my thumb over the metal and felt a slight tingling sensation. I can't explain why, but holding those keys made me feel exposed. It was like the air in the apartment changed the moment I touched them. That night I tried to ignore the closet. I closed the hidden panel as best I could. I put the strange items in a cardboard box and left them in the living room. Around midnight I was lying in bed trying to sleep. My mind wouldn't shut off. I kept replaying the day's events, especially the moment I saw that shadow slide across the wall. I stared at the ceiling. Every creak in the building made my heart jump. Around 2 a.m., I heard a faint scratching sound coming from behind the wall where the hidden room was. It was steady, like fingernails on plaster. My chest tightened, and I felt my stomach twist. I got up slowly and went to the closet door. I listened. The scratching continued for a few seconds, then stopped. My hands were trembling. I backed away and shut the bedroom door. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I decided to search the lobby for any old records or directories. There was a small bulletin board near the main entrance, and sometimes the landlord kept notices there. I found a metal filing cabinet in the maintenance room, but it was locked. I didn't want to force it open, so I just looked around for anything else. I saw a pile of folders on top of the cabinet. They were mostly lease agreements and repair logs. Nothing that explained hidden rooms or strange symbols. I ended up flipping through them for an hour, but I didn't see anything useful. Back in my apartment, I placed the old book on the coffee table again. I tried to match the symbols on the building map to the corners and hallways I knew. There were more hidden spaces marked, not just the one in my closet. There were at least 3 others throughout the building. The whispers in that secret room replayed in my head, and I felt a chill. I decided to investigate further, but I was afraid of what else I'd find. I didn't want to stumble onto more moving shadows or hear more unsettling voices, but I couldn't ignore it. I felt compelled to keep digging. I grabbed my flashlight, walked to the closet, and opened the hidden panel again. The air inside felt even colder than before. My breath caught in my throat. I aimed the flashlight around the space. The crates were where I left them, and so was the little table. The corner looked dark and still. Then I heard a whisper. It was right behind me. I spun around so fast I almost lost my balance. I saw another flicker of movement on the wall, like a shadow. This time it slid toward the spot where I found the mirror. I followed it. My mouth was dry and my legs felt shaky. When I reached the table, I saw the mirror was on its side. I hadn't left it that way. I tried to steady my breathing. My heart hammered, and my stomach clenched. I bent down, picked up the mirror, and held it up. The cracks in the glass distorted my reflection. I felt a surge of adrenaline and placed the mirror face down on the table. The whispering stopped. My pulse throbbed in my neck. I stepped back, then turned and left the room. I slid the panel shut behind me, pressing it closed with both hands. I stood there for a few minutes, leaning against the wall, trying to slow my breathing. I don't know who was in that building before me or what they left behind in that hidden space. I just know I can't walk past that closet without feeling a knot in my stomach. I hear faint whispers sometimes, even during the day. It sounds like words in a language I can't place. I see flickers of movement out of the corner of my eye. The tension in my body feels constant now. My shoulders ache from staying tight. My nights are restless, and every morning, I wake up drained. I'm determined to keep searching for clues. The old books, the keys, and the crates must mean something. Those shadows and whispers aren't random. This place holds secrets from the people who lived here long ago. I want to figure out what they did and why they left these items behind. I'm not ready to give up. But every time I enter that hidden room, my body responds with fear. My mind tells me to stop, but I know I can't. That's where I stand now, caught between curiosity and dread, in this apartment with a wall that leads to a room filled with shadows and voices. There's no going back. I can't ignore what's right here behind the closet. I felt a chill as soon as I stepped inside the old warehouse. The walls were tall and covered in patches of chipped paint. The metal doors groaned whenever I tried to push them open. The air smelled like stale water and rust. That smell filled my nostrils and made my eyes burn a little. I realized right away that this place had a strange atmosphere at night. I had worked in a few rundown buildings before, but nothing had ever made me feel so uneasy. My supervisor told me to keep watch from dusk until dawn and report any unusual activity. He didn't warn me about strange figures or bizarre noises. He only mentioned that the structure was old, so I should watch out for broken floors or loose stair railings. I assumed I would deal with nothing more than rats and leaky pipes. On my first night, I walked through the main corridor with a flashlight and a small radio. I heard my own footsteps echo off the concrete. Every time my boots hit the floor, the sound lingered for a moment. The place seemed bigger on the inside than it appeared from the street. The front entrance led to a wide loading area with stacked crates and dusty equipment. The rafters were high above me, and some of the overhead lights flickered. I tried switching them on, but most of the bulbs just hummed and stayed dim. I kept moving toward the back of the warehouse, checking for open doors or broken windows. I noticed a few cobwebs dangling near some large metal shelves. I brushed them aside with my hand. The webs felt sticky, and little bits of dust clung to my fingers. I wiped my hand on my pant leg. I pushed the door to a smaller storage room and scanned around with my flashlight. The floor was cluttered with old boxes. They smelled like old papers and dried glue. I heard a faint thump from somewhere down the hall. It could have been the pipes, but it didn't sound like regular plumbing. I turned off my flashlight and waited. I listened carefully. The warehouse had that hollow emptiness where even small sounds get amplified. After a few seconds, I heard a soft scraping sound, like something with claws moving against the concrete. It didn't match the shuffling of rats or the skitter of insects. It had more weight. My heart pounded as I turned the flashlight back on and headed in the direction of the noise. I didn't call anyone. I assumed it was some large stray cat or a raccoon. We were in the middle of the city, but wildlife sometimes slipped into old buildings. I reached the corridor leading toward a locked storage room. The door was always kept shut because they stored historical records there. My supervisor told me not to bother going in because the local preservation society had sealed everything to avoid damage. The sound seemed to come from that area. I walked closer and saw that the lock on the door had been tampered with. The metal looked scratched and bent. The door itself had deep gouges near the handle. They looked like claw marks, spaced out in a pattern that didn't match the size of any normal animal I knew. I felt a tightness in my stomach. My hands started sweating. I kept my flashlight trained on the door and reached out carefully. I turned the handle, and the door opened with a creak. I expected to see scattered papers or broken shelves. Instead, I saw row after row of wooden cabinets. They were arranged like a small archive, with each cabinet labeled by year. The light from my flashlight revealed thick dust on most surfaces. There was a musty odor in the air like a neglected library. I checked the floor for footprints. I saw no clear shoe prints, but I did see a few smudged marks. They looked more like paw prints, but they were elongated like the shape of a human hand with extended fingers. I felt my breathing speed up. My chest felt tight, and my pulse throbbed in my temples. I wanted to radio for backup, but I also felt a strange need to figure out what was going on. I walked in further, shining the light between the cabinets. I found some old newspapers stacked near the far wall. Their edges were yellow and brittle. A few were scattered across the floor as if someone had rifled through them. I stooped down and noticed headlines about odd local events. They mentioned secret gatherings, nighttime ceremonies, and obscure groups that met in this building decades ago. I read about rumored rituals that involved chanting and the use of strange symbols. My flashlight flickered for a moment, and I smacked it with my palm. That was when I heard a low growl behind me. I spun around. The beam of my flashlight cut across a shadow near one of the cabinets. I caught a glimpse of a figure hunched low. It had wiry limbs covered in patches of dark fur. Its face was partially hidden by the cabinet door, but I saw two reflective eyes. They had a faint glow, like a cat's eyes catching light in the dark. My stomach dropped and my hands shook. I stood still, not wanting to make sudden movements. The creature breathed in quick, hushed bursts, like an animal cornered in a trap. For a moment, neither of us moved. My mind felt blank except for one urgent thought: get away. But I forced myself to stay calm. I inched the flashlight closer to get a better look. The figure's outline was slim, almost too thin for a human. Its arms were longer than normal arms should be, and the fingers seemed to end in curved nails. The legs bent in a way that reminded me of a cat's hind legs, but the hips were shaped more like a person's. It shifted slightly, and I saw the faint outline of pointed ears on the top of its head. My breathing was loud in my own ears. The creature released another low rumble from its throat. I stepped back, and it scrambled behind the cabinet with a quick, fluid motion. I heard claws scraping across the floor and the cabinet shaking as it moved. Without thinking, I ran out of the room. My legs felt shaky, but I made it back to the main corridor before I stopped to catch my breath. My radio crackled with a bit of static, and a voice asked if everything was okay. I lied and said I heard some animals, but nothing major. My throat felt dry as I spoke. I spent the rest of that night pacing around the warehouse, trying to figure out if I had imagined the whole thing. Whenever I closed my eyes, I pictured that narrow face and those glowing eyes. I couldn't wait for my shift to end. By morning, I was exhausted, but I knew I had to come back the next night. I couldn't just walk away. Part of me needed to know how that creature got there. The next day, I arrived earlier than usual. I asked the daytime staff about any odd sightings, but they just shrugged. They told me the building had always attracted rumors because it was so old. Nobody seemed concerned. I checked a few official records. They didn't say anything about strange creatures, but I found references to a time when the building was used for meetings by a private group. The details were vague, but there were notes about odd practices. That night, I walked through the corridors again, focusing on the locked storage room. The door was still damaged, and I decided to slip inside. I didn't see the creature at first. I noticed the newspapers on the floor again, and I read more of them. The articles talked about alleged experiments that combined animal traits with human hosts. They mentioned the possibility of harnessing some type of primal energy. The language was direct, but some parts were blacked out. I felt a wave of nausea at the idea that something like that might be real. I heard movement overhead, near the rafters. I looked up and saw a shape perched on one of the wooden beams. My flashlight caught its face this time. It had a flat nose, slitted pupils, and a mouth that was slightly parted, showing teeth that looked sharp. Its body was curled into a crouch, and it stared down at me with an intense focus. My skin broke out in a cold sweat. I swallowed hard and slowly shifted my weight. My boots made a small scrape on the floor, and the creature reacted. It leaped to another beam with a swift motion. It didn't run away. It watched me from a different angle, tilting its head as if it was trying to gauge my intentions. I felt a mix of fear and curiosity, but mostly fear. My mind raced with questions about how it survived and why it stayed in the warehouse. I could smell the dust in the air, and I caught a faint animal scent that reminded me of a wet dog or a dirty cat. The creature made a guttural sound, and its ears twitched. I wondered if it understood I wasn't there to harm it. My heart thumped so hard that I felt a pulse in my neck. I tried to step closer to the center of the room. I kept my flashlight aimed at the floor instead of its face. I didn't want to startle it. The creature shifted again, grabbing a beam with its clawed hand and lowering itself until it hung by its arms and legs. It looked more human in that moment. though still wrong. I could see patches of hairless skin near the joints. The skin looked pale and rough, with small scars that traced around the shoulders. The arms and legs were extremely lean, with tight muscles that seemed ready to spring at any moment. I decided not to push my luck. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on it. I left the storage room and closed the door as gently as possible. For the next hour, I patrolled other areas, trying to organize my thoughts. At one point, I felt a surge of adrenaline that made my hands tremble. I realized my breathing was shallow, so I took a few deep breaths. I told myself to stay calm and do my job. I circled back to the front desk area and tried to read more about the building's history on an old computer. I found records of local rumors about rituals that took place 50 years ago. People claimed they heard chanting and saw people in hoods bringing in large crates late at night. Officials dismissed it as urban legend. I clicked through scanned documents and found references to transmutation ceremonies, but the records were incomplete. It seemed the group disbanded after local authorities questioned them. Some members vanished, and others left the city. The official story was that they were just an eccentric group with an interest in folklore. I couldn't confirm anything else, but I felt sure it was connected to the creature I saw. Over the next week, I stayed on high alert. I heard the creature's movements in different parts of the building. Sometimes I caught sight of it near the rafters or inside the locked storage room. It never tried to attack me, but I could sense tension every time we crossed paths. My mouth would go dry, my muscles would stiffen, and I'd get this jolt of heat in my chest. My flashlight became my closest companion. I even started leaving little bits of canned food in certain spots, just to see if it would take them. Some nights the food disappeared and I'd find scratches on the floor nearby. I dug deeper into the warehouse's archives whenever I had a spare moment. I found more articles describing experiments that aimed to fuse human and animal traits. They mentioned ceremonies that involved chanting, incense, and odd artifacts. There was a suggestion that these rituals took place in the basement, which had been sealed off when the building was converted for storage. I hadn't explored the basement yet, so I decided I should check it out. On my 8th night, I used a set of old keys to unlock a heavy door near the back stairwell. The hinges screeched when I pushed it open. Dust fell from the doorway, making me cough. My flashlight revealed a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The concrete steps were damp. My pulse hammered in my throat. Each step echoed. The basement was cramped, with a low ceiling. The smell of wet earth and mildew surrounded me. I found a series of small rooms with stone walls. In one room, I discovered an old metal table with leather straps. The surface was stained and scratched. Next to it, I saw shelves that held glass jars filled with cloudy liquid. The labels were too faded to read. One jar had something floating inside that looked like a twisted piece of fur and skin. My stomach turned, and I had to take a moment to steady myself. I heard a noise behind me, like a soft hiss. I spun around, flashlight sweeping across the room. The creature stood in the doorway. It squeezed through the narrow opening, its body tense. Its lips were drawn back, exposing sharp teeth. I felt my breathing halt. My mouth hung open and I gripped the flashlight until my knuckles burned. We stared at each other. The creature's chest rose and fell rapidly. It made a sound that was somewhere between a growl and a hiss. I held my ground, not moving. After what felt like a minute, it turned and moved out of sight. I heard its claws click on the damp floor, then fade into the darkness. I stumbled back up the stairs. The tension in my body made my head pound and my lungs burned from holding my breath. Since then, I've been convinced that the creature is a product of those old rituals. Whatever happened in this warehouse left behind more than rumors. I still work here, and I still see signs of it almost every night. Sometimes I see it lurking at the edge of the corridor. Sometimes I hear scratching above me. It never tries to hurt me. It stays close, but it never makes direct contact. I think it's as curious about me as I am about it. I keep my flashlight and my radio at all times. I walk slowly, and I try not to surprise it. I don't mention it to my supervisor or the others. I'm not sure they would believe me, and I don't want anyone to try to hunt it. It doesn't seem hostile. It feels like it's trapped in a place it never asked to be. I figure that as long as it doesn't threaten me, I'll keep its existence quiet. That's my job now. I guard the old warehouse and I keep watch over a creature that doesn't belong in this world. I don't know if it will ever leave, but I know I'm not alone here at night. And despite the fear that creeps up my spine whenever I hear its low growl, I've come to accept that this is my new normal. It's not comfortable, but it's real, and every shift brings me face to face with that reality. I felt a surge of adrenaline the moment I turned onto that empty highway. The air was cool, and I could see the headlights bounce on patches of uneven asphalt. My body was tense. I gripped the wheel with both hands, trying to ignore the knot in my stomach. I had no clear destination. I only knew that I wanted to drive somewhere quiet. I wanted to see how far I could go without encountering another soul. That plan changed the second I saw the first road sign shift under my headlights. I noticed it just after a sharp bend. It was a simple directional sign, but it wasn't in the same position when I passed it as it had been a second before. I felt my chest tighten. I slowed down and glanced in the rearview mirror. The sign was still there, but I could have sworn it moved a few feet to the side. The wind felt harsh against my window. My ears caught a strange rustling sound. My hands felt sweaty on the wheel. I kept driving. My heart pounded harder with each mile. I tried to explain it away. Maybe the sign was loose in the ground. Maybe I imagined the shift. But after a few more miles, I saw another sign on the side of the road. This one pointed toward a town I'd never heard of, but the arrow seemed off. I felt a jolt of confusion. I decided to keep my focus on the road. My mouth felt dry. I took a quick sip of water from a bottle on the passenger seat. The water tasted stale. I concentrated on the strip of pavement ahead. I switched on the high beams to see farther. The road stretched out, empty and dark, with no lights except my own. That made it worse. It felt like the darkness around me wanted to close in. The next few miles dragged. My back started to ache from sitting so stiffly. My mind drifted to the events of that afternoon. I had planned this trip as a getaway. I wanted peace. Instead, I felt a growing unease in my stomach. I found myself checking the mirrors more often. That's when I saw a beam of light behind me. It was faint but steady. It looked like another set of headlights. My pulse started racing. I couldn't see a car shape. I only saw the glow. I slowed down a bit, waiting for whoever was behind me to catch up. But the lights never got closer. They stayed at the same distance, always lingering at the edge of my rearview mirror. Sometimes they flickered. I gripped the wheel tighter. My neck felt stiff when I turned to glance back through the rear window. I saw no car, only darkness and that faint glow. I decided to pull over. I wanted to confirm if I was imagining things. I pressed the brake gently and guided my car to the shoulder. My tires crunched on gravel. I turned off the engine and stepped out. The chill in the air made the hairs on my arms stand on end. The highway was silent, except for a light wind that rustled the nearby bushes. My breath felt shallow. I stood there scanning the distance. There was no sign of another vehicle. The air smelled of dust and cold metal. My heart thumped in my ears. I turned to look at the sign next to my car. It pointed to a rest area 5 miles ahead. I leaned forward, checking the base of the sign. It stood firmly in the ground. I ran my hand over the metal. It felt rough and cold. I got back in the car. My fingers trembled when I turned the key. The engine roared to life. The faint headlights behind me were gone, but I felt a deep urge to keep moving. I didn't want to stay in one place. I buckled my seatbelt, adjusted my mirrors, and pressed on the accelerator. The tires rolled back onto the road with a slight bump. I stayed under the speed limit to keep my attention focused. My eyes darted from side to side, looking for the faint lights or moving signs. The wind outside picked up, and I heard a gentle whistle that came through a small gap in the window. That whistle turned into a low whisper. It made my scalp prickle. My shoulders felt stiff. My legs started to ache from holding the gas pedal in one position for so long. Then I saw another sign. This one was off to the right, standing at the edge of an overlook. The sign said, "Scenic Viewpoint." I decided to stop. My brain told me that I needed a break, and I wanted to see the landscape to calm my nerves. I pulled into the small parking area. There were no other cars. The overhead lights in the viewpoint area were dim and a few flickered. I turned off my engine again. Everything around me felt too quiet. I stepped out and stretched my back. My joints popped. The breeze carried a strange murmur. I tried to ignore it. I walked to the edge of the viewpoint. There was a low stone wall. Beyond that wall, I saw hills and a winding river in the distance. The moon was out, and its light gave the scene a pale, eerie glow. I stood there with my hands on the stone, feeling its rough texture. I heard a faint whisper behind me. I turned around. That's when I saw a figure a few yards away. It didn't move. It looked transparent, but I could see it had a human outline. My heart hammered, and I felt a jolt of cold sweat on my forehead. I wanted to get back in my car, but my legs locked up. I just stood there, staring at it. The figure stepped closer. I didn't see a face or clothes. It was just a hazy shape, like a presence. My chest felt tight. The whispering grew louder, but I couldn't make out words. It was more like a breathy sound. I felt my mouth go dry. My head throbbed with fear, but something about its movement seemed calm, not aggressive. I stayed where I was. My legs shook. The figure lifted an arm, pointing toward a small path to the left of the parking lot. I noticed a wooden sign near that path, but the letters were faint. I swallowed and glanced at the figure again. It was still pointing. I breathed hard. My thoughts raced. I considered getting back in the car and driving away, but my curiosity pushed me forward. I took slow steps toward the path. My sneakers crunched on small rocks. I smelled damp dirt. My hands were shaking so much I had to clench them into fists. The figure followed at a slight distance. I kept looking over my shoulder to see if it was still there. It was. It seemed focused on guiding me. The path was narrow. Thick bushes lined the sides. I heard rustling in the leaves, and I felt a chill on my neck. At one point, I stopped to catch my breath. My heart pounded and my legs felt weak. The figure paused as well, staying a few feet behind me. I continued forward, seeing the path open up into a small clearing. The moonlight made the clearing visible. There were stones arranged in a circle. They formed a pattern on the ground. I stepped closer and saw strange markings on each rock. I didn't recognize them. The sight made my stomach tighten. My hands felt clammy. I looked back at the figure. It stood at the edge of the clearing, still watching me. I bent down to inspect the stones. Each one was about the size of my forearm. They had grooves that looked carved, but the edges were worn down. I ran my fingertips over one of the grooves. It felt smoother than I expected. I heard the whispering again. This time it seemed to drift around my ears. I looked up. The figure had moved closer, pointing at the center of the circle. I saw a shallow pit there, lined with small pebbles. My heart pounded so hard that my shirt felt tight against my chest. I stepped toward it, unsure of why I was doing it. I felt a heavy sense of unease, but I was also drawn to it. At the center, I saw a reflection of the moonlight in a small pool of water. The water smelled a bit musty. I crouched to look at it. My breath formed short clouds in the cold air. My head felt light. The reflection on the water's surface seemed to shift. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. Then I heard a sudden whoosh behind me. I spun around, standing up too fast. My vision blurred for a second. When it cleared, I saw the figure at the circle's edge. It raised one arm again, pointing upward. I followed the direction of its arm and looked at the sky. The moon was bright, nearly full. A wave of fear washed over me. My knees felt weak. My brain flooded with questions. Why was this happening? What did the figure want? I glanced back at the stones and realized they were arranged in a shape that matched the moon's outline in the sky. I swallowed hard. My throat felt scratchy. I remembered hearing local stories about places with strange energy, especially during certain phases of the moon. My eyes flicked to the figure again. It kept pointing at the sky. Then it shifted its arm to point at me and then at the water. I felt an odd sense of pressure in my ears. My skin tingled. I backed away a step. My breath came in short bursts. The figure didn't move closer. I looked at the water again. The reflection rippled even though there was no breeze. My body felt shaky, but I reached out with my hand, hovering over the surface. My fingertips brushed it. The water felt cold, almost icy. I lifted my hand and noticed small droplets shining on my skin. The whispering grew louder, circling around me. I felt my heart hammering against my ribs. My mind was scattered, but I knew I had to stay calm. I took one step back. My foot slipped on a loose stone and I stumbled, catching myself with my hands on the damp earth. My palms stung from the impact. The figure didn't react. It just stood there, as if waiting. I got up. Dirt clung to my jeans. My pulse still hammered, but I steadied my breathing. I couldn't keep standing in that circle. I felt an urge to leave. I turned to the figure and tried to speak. My voice came out raspy. "What do you want?" I asked in a shaky tone. The figure kept pointing, now at the horizon. I saw the outline of hills and that winding road I'd driven in on. Then it lowered its arm and stood still. I swallowed, my throat dry. I understood it wanted me to return to the road. Something about this place was tied to the lunar cycle. I remembered the stories I'd heard about strange gatherings that happened under the full moon. My skin prickled at the thought. I stepped away from the center of the circle. The figure stayed behind, letting me pass. I could feel it watching me. My mouth felt cottony, and my chest was tight. I paused at the clearing's edge and looked back one last time. The figure raised its arm in a slow wave, more of a motion than a greeting. I walked down the path again, feeling the crunch of gravel under my shoes. The whispering faded, replaced by the sound of my own breathing. Each step felt heavy, but the further I got from the clearing, the calmer I felt. When I emerged at the scenic viewpoint parking lot, I looked around. The night felt silent again. The sky was clear, and the moonlight lit up the cracks in the pavement. I crossed the lot toward my car. I noticed the same whisper of wind, but it felt weaker. My fingers shook when I reached for the door handle. I glanced around, half expecting the figure to appear behind me. It didn't. I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. I flipped on the headlights. They cast two bright beams into the darkness. I realized I was drenched in sweat. My shirt clung to my back. I reached for the air conditioner dial, but my hand paused. I felt an impulse to leave the windows down, to let the night air in. My mind was still racing, but I wanted that connection with the outside, even if it scared me. I eased the car back onto the road. The tires rolled over a shallow dip near the entrance, and my stomach fluttered from the movement. I continued along the dark highway, noticing the signs again. This time they stayed where they were. None of them shifted. I couldn't see any headlights behind me. I felt alone, yet I sensed a presence all around. My arms were tense from gripping the wheel. I forced myself to loosen my hands a bit. The miles passed without major incident. Occasionally, I heard that faint whisper through the wind, but it never got louder. After a few more bends, I noticed a small clearing on the side of the road. I pulled over again, wanting a short break to gather my thoughts. I turned off the engine and listened. The night air was still. I heard distant chirping from insects. I didn't see any spectral figures. My mind replayed the events at the clearing, the stones, the water, the gestures of that figure. I felt a dull ache at the base of my skull. I took a deep breath and exhaled, focusing on the present. The next thought that came to me was that this road was part of a cycle. Maybe these events always happened around this time of the month. I I remembered the bright moon overhead. It was almost full. My gut told me that once the moon changed, the whispers and the strange lights might fade. I sat there for a few minutes, leaning my head against the seat. My eyelids felt heavy, but I didn't trust the idea of sleep. I wouldn't rest until I reached a place with people, with normal lights and noise. I keyed the ignition one more time and got back on the highway. My tires left small dust clouds behind me. The next sign indicated another 30 miles to the nearest town. That felt like a lifetime away, but I was determined to get there. I checked my mirrors. I saw nothing but darkness. I gritted my teeth, trying to ignore the tension in my neck. As the car gained speed, I noticed a small glimmer in the corner of the mirror again. It flickered once. My pulse jumped, then it vanished. I kept driving. My shoulders ached. My mouth felt parched, but I didn't want to stop again. I turned on the radio, but there was only static. I clicked it off. The wind noise was my only companion. I thought about the figure at the viewpoint, about the silent guidance it offered. I recalled its calm presence. It hadn't attacked me or tried to harm me. It led me to that clearing, showed me something I didn't understand, and then let me go. I inhaled through my nose, exhaled through my mouth, and continued down the road. The next 30 miles stretched on. The moonlight seemed weaker now, or maybe clouds were rolling in. When I finally saw the first sign of civilization, a dim streetlight on the outskirts of a small town, I felt relief in my chest. The road straightened out, and houses appeared in the distance. I realized I was breathing more easily. My fingers relaxed on the steering wheel. I saw a gas station sign glowing faintly. I pulled in, parked near a pump, and sat there for a moment. The overhead light felt comforting. I closed my eyes and let out a shaky breath. Nobody else was there, but I didn't feel alone in a threatening way anymore. I stepped out, feeling the concrete under my shoes. The station smelled like old fuel and stale coffee. I opened the store door. A lone clerk stood behind the counter, half asleep. I grabbed a bottle of water from a cooler, paid for it, and walked back outside. I leaned against my car, taking a few sips. The water tasted fresh, and it soothed my dry throat. My hands felt steadier. My mind still buzzed with thoughts of that figure in the circle of stones. I wondered if other travelers had seen the same thing, but I didn't want to dwell on it too much right then. I checked my phone, hoping for a signal. I had a weak bar, so I opened the map. I saw that the next major town was about another hour away. I glanced back at the dark highway behind me. I felt a lingering chill, but at least I was away from the more isolated stretch. I wiped some sweat from my forehead with the back of my hand. My heart rate had slowed down. I twisted the cap back on my water bottle and got into the car once more. The engine started smoothly. The gas tank was almost full, so I decided I had enough to reach my final stop without trouble. As I pulled out of the station, I looked up at the moon. Clouds covered part of it now. A slight breeze ruffled the trees near the roadside. I didn't hear any whispers. The road ahead had normal signs and streetlights. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in me. I knew that what I saw was real. I drove on, letting the night guide me. I had a feeling that when the moon's cycle shifted again, that place might come alive once more. For now, I felt safer. I focused on the pavement, on the next town, on the passing landscape. The figure's silent guidance stayed with me, but I kept my eyes forward. I just wanted to reach a place where the light stayed still, and the only whispers belonged to the wind. I arrived at the hotel on a rainy afternoon. The building stood on a hill surrounded by twisted trees and uneven ground. I walked through the front door, set my luggage on the old rug, and felt a cold draft pass across my arms. My chest felt tight, and my mouth went dry. Something about the lobby felt heavy and silent. The reception desk was dusty, and the registers looked old. I saw no one waiting to greet me, even though I was supposed to be the new manager. That was my first sign that this place had secrets hidden in its walls. My first night was quiet until around midnight. I was in my room, reading through old paperwork. The walls were plain, the furniture was worn, and the window overlooked a courtyard with broken paving stones. The rain tapped on the glass. At around 12:30 a.m., I heard a faint shuffle in the hallway. It made the hairs on my arms stand up. I stared at the door. I didn't move for a long time. Then I heard the shuffle again, followed by a soft scraping sound. I stood up, opened the door, and saw nothing but dim light falling on the faded carpet. I couldn't see anyone, but I felt a chill crawl up my back. I had a strange sense that something stood in the corner watching. I shut the door, locked it, and stayed awake until dawn. The next morning, I walked through the lobby and found the old caretaker in a small office near the back. He wore a gray shirt and loose pants. His hair was thin, and his hands trembled when he picked up the files I needed to sign. He didn't say much, only nodded when I introduced myself. I asked him if there were other employees around, and he shook his head. He told me it was just him and a part-time housekeeper. The caretaker's eyes were tired. He didn't smile. He seemed to avoid eye contact whenever I mentioned the late hours or the noises I'd heard. He told me, "You'll get used to the nights," and then he changed the subject. Later that day, I explored the corridors. I counted 40 rooms spread over 2 floors, plus a basement that smelled of mold. The walls in some corridors were chipped, and the wallpaper peeled in several spots. The doors had scratches near the doorknobs as though guests had fumbled for keys in the dark. Every step I took echoed on the floors. In the dining room, chairs were stacked in a corner. The tables had stained covers. I saw no sign of recent visitors, and the caretaker told me guests stopped coming years ago. I made a mental note to check the hotel's history in the county records. That evening, I went to the manager's office on the ground floor. It was a cramped room with a single window facing the side yard. The air felt stale, so I opened the window for fresh air. A few minutes later, I began searching through dusty files. Some were old employee records, some were old receipts from when the hotel still had regular customers, and some were letters of complaint about noise or flickering lights at night. One letter mentioned an odd figure that seemed to appear in the corridor outside room 14. Another letter mentioned an unsettling shadow near the staircase. The words gave me goosebumps. My legs felt restless and my stomach turned. I kept reading until it got late. Around 11 p.m., I left the office and walked down the main corridor. My shoes made a dull thud with each step. The lights flickered in a slow pattern. I felt alone, but I also felt that same chill on my neck. I stopped near room 14 and listened. The door was closed, and the doorknob was cold. I opened the door, flipped on the light, and saw that the bed was made but covered in dust. The curtains were drawn. The lamp on the nightstand flickered for a moment, then held a steady glow. I checked the closet and bathroom. Everything was empty. When I turned to leave, I heard a faint hum. It came from the corner behind me. I spun around and my heart pounded. The air felt dense. I saw a shape that seemed to twist in the low light. It was a mass of darkness like a thick cloud. It hovered near the wall, making a soft crackling sound. It vanished in an instant, like it was never there. I ran out of the room, slammed the door, and stood in the corridor with my lungs burning from panic. I barely slept that night. I tossed in bed, listening for every scrape or footstep. My mind replayed that moment in room 14. My chest felt tight, and my hands felt clammy. In the morning, I confronted the caretaker and told him what I saw. His eyes dropped to the floor. He whispered something about eco da escuridão, an old rumor about a presence that lived in the hotel. He said it didn't harm people, but it fed on old memories and secrets in the building. He said some people claimed the hotel used to be a private retreat where guests came to escape city life. Over time, the place fell into disrepair. Rumors spread that strange things happened at night. The caretaker shrugged and said, "No one ever got hurt, but it can mess with your head if you stare at it too long." He wouldn't say anything else. After lunch, I went into the basement. The steps creaked under my weight. A single bulb near the entrance cast a weak glow across damp brick walls. The air smelled wet, and there were boxes stacked along one wall. I rummaged through old ledgers, receipts, and brochures. My knees started to ache from bending, and the dust made my eyes water. I found a binder with articles clipped from local newspapers. One article mentioned that the hotel's original owner had a fascination with unexplained phenomena. Another article described guests reporting sightings of a shifting shadow in the halls. Then I saw one page that called it Echo da Escuridão, explaining that this presence was said to reflect the energy of the building, especially secrets or hidden regrets left behind by visitors over the years. I stayed in the basement for hours, reading and sorting. My throat felt dry and my back felt stiff, but I didn't want to stop. I learned that the presence wasn't new. People had written letters to the local paper about it decades ago. Some said it was just superstition. Others claimed it was the spirit of the original owner. There were no records of violence or destruction. No one talked about injuries. The worst anyone mentioned was a deep sense of unease that lingered long after leaving. The caretaker had been right. It didn't kill or harm. It just existed, and it terrified people who saw it. That evening, I walked around with a flashlight. I felt determined to gather more details. Each corridor was empty and my footsteps echoed. Every few minutes, I stopped to listen. Around 10 p.m., I stood by a window on the second floor, peering at the dark courtyard. The moonlight revealed rusted patio furniture and old stone arches. Suddenly, I heard a scraping sound behind me. My breath caught in my throat. I turned quickly and aimed my flashlight. At first, I saw nothing. Then I caught a glimpse of a faint figure near the corner. The shape looked incomplete. It moved in a jerky motion like it was struggling to keep its form. I felt my chest tighten, and my palms began to sweat. My mind raced, wondering if I should run. Instead, I took a slow step forward. I heard a low humming noise. The shape rippled, then vanished. The corridor felt colder. I stood there, breathing hard, my heart pounding against my ribs. I decided to check an old storeroom at the far end of the second floor. The door was stiff and I had to push it hard. The room smelled like stale air and old varnish. Furniture covered in sheets lined the walls. I aimed my flashlight across the room, spotting more boxes and a pile of old blankets. My throat felt tight, but I forced myself to stay. I hoped I might find more documents or some clue that explained the presence. While I searched, I heard what sounded like soft breathing behind me. I spun around, heart thudding against my chest, but I saw no one. Then the light flickered. The door slammed shut on its own. I froze. My muscles tensed, and I felt short of breath. The shape appeared again near the far wall, shifting in and out of view. I approached it, keeping the flashlight pointed forward. Its form pulsed, like it was alive but not solid. The hum grew louder, then it cut out. The next moment, the shape disappeared and the door slowly swung open again. I couldn't stop shaking. My hands shook so badly I had to grip the flashlight with both hands. I left the storeroom and went back to my office. My heart still pounded, and my mind felt jumbled. I pulled out the newspaper clippings again and read through them more carefully. One snippet described how the Echo da Escuridão thrived on abandoned spaces and hidden truths. The writer claimed it was a remnant of the old owner's obsession with capturing energy from the building itself. The article suggested that the presence appeared to remind people of the past, but it never explained exactly why or how it survived. Another snippet said that the more someone sought it out, the more it appeared, almost like it recognized curiosity. I sat back in my chair and tried to calm down. My hands still felt clammy, and my breathing was unsteady. Over the next few days, I developed a routine. During daylight, I would inspect the property, check the plumbing, and verify that the electricity was working. The caretaker assisted when he felt up to it. He was getting older, and his joints bothered him. He also disliked talking about the presence. When I asked him direct questions, he shrugged or found a reason to leave. So I focused on the physical tasks. I replaced some light bulbs, cleaned out the dining area, and sorted more boxes in the basement. I couldn't ignore the tension that stuck around every time night approached. My shoulders felt tight, and I had trouble eating dinner. My appetite vanished after sundown, and I drank coffee to stay alert. At night, I walked the corridors and took notes on where I saw or heard anything. I marked down times, locations, and descriptions of the shape. Sometimes I only heard a faint hum or a scrape. Other times I saw it near a door or at the end of a hallway, drifting in and out of sight. Each encounter made my heart pound. My skin prickled with cold sweat. I felt a tightness in my stomach that took hours to fade. But I pressed on, determined to understand the connection between the building and the presence. About a week in, I discovered an old ledger in the back of the manager's desk drawer. It held records from decades ago: check-ins, check-outs, staff schedules, notes on repairs. In the margins, I found strange notations. One entry read, "Humming noise outside room 9, 2:15 a.m. Another said, "Dark figure spotted in stairwell, staff saw it vanish." These entries continued for several pages, all describing events late at night. Some staff had tried to chase the shape, but found only empty halls. Others reported hearing doors slam with no one around. The final entries mentioned that the owner instructed them to keep quiet. The staff seemed to comply. After that, the ledger ended. There was no clear conclusion. One night, I heard a knocking sound near the lobby. I hurried downstairs, flashlight in hand. The caretaker was there, pacing by the front desk. He looked uneasy. He told me he heard noises coming from behind the storage room near the kitchen. We walked there together. My hands felt sweaty on the flashlight, and he kept shifting his weight from foot to foot. Inside the storage room, the temperature felt colder than before. The caretaker lifted a broom, like he might use it if something jumped out. Then the shadowy shape appeared again, hovering above some crates. We both stood still. My pulse hammered in my ears. The caretaker's face tightened. He let out a sharp breath. I took one step forward and felt the air pulse with a low vibration. The shape flickered, and I had a strong urge to back away. My mind went blank except for one thought: don't lose sight of it. Then it vanished. The caretaker lowered the broom. We looked at each other without saying a word. He nodded once and left. I could feel the tension in my neck for hours after that. I spent the rest of the night in my office, reading and rereading the notes I had gathered. I realized that this presence had been seen by almost everyone who stayed here for a long period. It appeared more often when people tried to uncover the hotel's hidden stories. It never attacked, but it unleashed waves of fear that made people tremble or run. I checked my watch. It was almost 3 a.m. I felt exhausted, but I refused to go to bed. I sat there, light on, waiting for dawn. On the following morning, I walked outside to clear my head. The air was cold, and the ground was wet from light rain. The trees around the property shifted in the breeze. I tried to focus on the physical details: the gravel under my shoes, the smell of damp leaves, the wind stinging my cheeks. My mind was still fixated on the shape I kept seeing. I wanted answers, but all the documents I found only confirmed the same thing. Eco da Escuridão was part of the hotel's fabric, tied to the building's past, feeding on memories and unresolved histories. I went back in and told the caretaker that I planned to keep managing the hotel, even if no guests came. I said I needed more time to figure out if we could reopen. He nodded, then walked off. He seemed relieved that I wasn't quitting. I spent the rest of the day patching minor leaks and checking which rooms were still usable. By dusk, I felt the tension return. My hands shook when I locked the front door. I didn't know if I'd see the shape again, but I felt certain it would show itself if I wandered the halls. That night, I decided not to go looking. Instead, I stayed in my room. I heard a few creaks outside my door, but I ignored them. My heart beat faster each time I heard a small sound, but I forced myself to stay put. Around 2 a.m., I heard a soft hum right outside the door. My breathing sped up and my chest felt tight. I thought about throwing the door open, but I couldn't move. The hum faded after a few seconds. I sat there in bed, eyes wide open, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. I'm still here, running this place. I've learned to handle the fear. The eco da escuridão doesn't cause physical harm. It just appears, vanishes, and leaves people shaking. I'm still digging through the archives, hoping to piece together more facts. I've made notes in my own log, recording each encounter. It shows up in different parts of the hotel, usually at night, always in a silent way. When it's gone, the air feels cold for a while. My pulse takes a long time to settle back to normal. I don't know if I'll ever understand it fully, but I keep trying. I keep the lights on, walk the halls, and brace myself for that shiver in the air. The caretaker quietly helps. He never asks about my late-night activities, and I never ask him about his. We just maintain the building, fix what needs fixing, and avoid letting our minds spiral. The hotel is quiet most days, with only the wind and the old floors creaking. At night, there's a different energy. The shape lurks around corners, reminding me that the hotel's past is still alive in some form. I can't say how long I'll stay, but I'm not leaving yet. This place has its hold on me now, and I want to see if there's more to discover in these silent corridors. That's the truth of it. I'm just a man who took over a forgotten hotel and found something unexplainable in its halls. I'm still here, hoping one day I'll learn the final piece of its story. I stepped inside that old building because I needed something different. I had spent months in modern studios, but everything felt too polished. I wanted raw energy. I needed a place with creaking floors and worn-out walls. I remember standing in the main hallway, smelling mildew and feeling the chill of the stone under my feet. I heard dripping water in a distant corner, like a slow, steady beat. That first impression told me I was in a place that held secrets. My goal was simple. I wanted to record new tracks that wouldn't sound like anything else. I heard about this old studio from a friend who said it used to be run by some eccentric musician decades ago. He didn't give me details, but he said the space came with character. I liked that word. It meant it wasn't perfect. It meant the walls might have stories. I had no idea what I was getting into. I signed the rental papers the same day I visited. The caretaker was a thin man with a quiet voice. He handed me a set of keys without much eye contact. He just reminded me that the place was old and needed respect. He said the last few people who recorded there left in a hurry. He didn't elaborate. He only said the building had unique acoustics, and that the previous tenants found it unnerving. I shrugged and told him I'd be careful. I was excited about the possibility of capturing strange echoes or textures. When I arrived with my gear, I noticed the hallway lights flickered. I thought it was a bad connection or old wiring. It didn't bother me. I carried my recording equipment up 2 flights of stairs because the elevator was out of service. The caretaker said it got stuck sometimes. I could feel the sweat on my forehead by the time I reached the studio door. The hallway smelled like dust and something stale. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and the sound traveled far down the corridor. I felt like I was stepping into a different era. The door to the studio had a few scratches. The paint was chipped around the handle. Inside, the room was larger than I expected. There was an upright piano near one wall, a couple of chairs stacked in the corner, and an old wooden desk filled with random papers. A small window faced a brick wall outside. The space was dim even with the overhead light, which buzzed quietly. I tested it by flicking the switch a few times. It stayed on, but flickered occasionally. I left it alone, figuring I could bring my own lamps if I needed extra light. I started by setting up my microphones and cables. I turned on my laptop and audio interface. Then I plugged in an electric guitar to test the sound quality. The reverb in the room felt natural. The shape of the walls gave a deep echo, which I liked. I strummed a few chords. I heard my guitar's sound bounce back, but it had a slight delay. It wasn't massive, but it was noticeable. I checked for any weird reverberation in my recordings. Everything seemed normal at first. That night, after a few hours of playing, I sensed a faint vibration through the floor. I paused. I thought maybe a big truck was passing outside, but I didn't hear any engine. The vibration felt like a soft pulse. I stood still and listened. My arms had goosebumps. Nothing else happened, so I decided to ignore it. I recorded a rough track and then packed up for the night. When I left, I noticed how quiet the hallway was. No hum of appliances, no voices. I locked the door and heard my own breathing echo on the walls. I hurried down the stairs, feeling uneasy. The next day, I got there in the late afternoon. I brought a few more instruments. I had a keyboard, a bass guitar, and a small drum machine. I set up everything near the center of the room. I wanted to try layering different sounds. While adjusting my microphone stands, I heard a tapping noise from behind the piano. It was a slow, irregular tap, like someone flicking their finger against the wood. I walked over to check, but there was nothing there. The tapping stopped when I looked. I shrugged and moved on. I started recording. I played a few riffs on the guitar while the drum machine kept a steady beat. My laptop captured everything fine. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a single note from the piano. It was just one key pressed softly like a gentle ding. I spun around, expecting to see someone. The room was empty. I walked to the piano and lifted the lid. The strings looked old, but intact. I pressed a key to compare the sound. It matched the tone I heard. I felt a tightness in my chest. I closed the lid and took a breath. Maybe the old building had shifts in temperature that caused the strings to resonate. I told myself that could be the explanation. I replayed the session from my laptop. I heard my guitar, the drum machine, and then that single piano note. It was clear, like an intentional press. My shoulders tensed, and my breath got shallow. I tried to calm down. I decided to record again to see if it happened once more. For an hour, nothing weird happened. I packed up for the night, making sure to lock everything. When I stepped outside the studio, the hallway felt colder than usual, and I had the sense that something was watching me. My legs felt heavy as I walked to the stairs. I reminded myself that old buildings make strange noises. I tried to relax, but my mind stayed on that piano note. On the third day, I decided to push forward. I wanted to capture something new. If this place had unusual acoustics, maybe I could use them. I got there earlier, around noon, hoping more daylight would keep me from spooking myself. I sat at the piano this time. I was curious about its range and how it sounded in the room. I played a simple melody while recording with a microphone set right above the strings. The sound was warm but had a slight echo. I could hear the faint squeak of the stool whenever I shifted my weight. I liked how intimate the recording felt. After about 20 minutes, I paused to listen back. While I was silent, the microphone picked up a low hum. It wasn't feedback. It sounded like someone singing a single note. It lasted for a few seconds and then stopped. I felt my heart pounding. I checked my gear to see if anything was faulty. Everything was normal. I replayed the recording. The hum was there. I felt a chill on my arms. I replayed it 3 times, trying to see if there was a pattern. It always sounded like a sustained note, quiet, but distinct. I leaned closer to the piano and said out loud, "Hello?" I waited. Nothing happened. I felt a little embarrassed talking to an empty room, but I needed to see if something would respond. I waited for a minute. I only heard faint creaks in the floorboards. I rubbed my temples, unsure if I was imagining things. Then I decided to record again. I asked questions out loud. "Is anyone here? Can you hear me?" My voice shook a bit. After I finished, I listened back. I heard a soft knock, like knuckles against wood. My mouth went dry. I stood up and walked around the room. I touched the walls to feel if there were any hidden pipes or something that could explain the knocks. The walls felt cold and solid. No hollow spots that I could find. I noticed a cabinet I hadn't opened yet. It was next to the desk. I tried to pull the door, but it was stuck. I pulled harder, and the door scraped open. Inside there were old papers, some scribbled sheet music, and a notebook with a broken spine. The pages were yellow and filled with handwritten notes. I flipped through them. Most of it looked like fragments of compositions. I recognized chord progressions, chord names, and measure counts. I saw scribbles in the margins, little lines that looked like attempts at new melodies. I noticed that some pages had faint stains, maybe from coffee or water damage. Nothing indicated who wrote them, but I guessed it was the old musician who once owned the place. I set the notebook aside on the desk and returned to my instruments. I tried to focus on my work, but my eyes kept drifting to the notebook. I decided to scan through it more carefully. On the last page, I found a passage that mentioned a resonance experiment. It said something about capturing the essence of a composition beyond physical performance. I didn't understand all of it, but it seemed like the composer believed music could linger in a space even after the musician left. I felt a strange heaviness in my stomach when I read that. I closed the notebook and stared at the piano. I spent the next few hours recording random pieces, trying out different styles. As I played, I kept hearing slight variations in the echoes. Sometimes it sounded like a second instrument joining me, as if a faint chord would form around my notes. It wasn't always consistent, but it happened enough times that I stopped playing to check my monitors. At one point, I clearly heard a small sequence of notes that I hadn't played. It was short, maybe 2 or 3 notes, like someone responding to my chords. I felt my back tense up and I stared at the piano keys. They didn't move. The microphone, however, picked up that short sequence. My breathing got shallow. My hands felt clammy. I couldn't explain it. I wanted to pack up and leave, but I also wanted to understand what was happening. I decided to hit record again and speak. I said, "If you can hear me, play something. Show me you're here." My voice sounded shaky in my ears. I stood back and waited, staring at the piano. At first, nothing happened. I was about to stop the recording when the piano's highest key made a soft tone. I felt my knees weaken. I took a quick step backward. The key didn't look pressed down. The note was faint but clear. I paused the recording and replayed it. The note was there, captured. My mind raced with thoughts. I didn't have any rational explanation. I decided I needed a break. My heart was pounding too fast. I left the room, locked it, and walked to the stairwell. I could feel sweat on my forehead. The hallway was silent, but I sensed pressure in my ears, like the air was heavy. I forced myself to breathe slowly. I felt both scared and curious. After a few minutes, I returned to the studio. I told myself I could handle it. I set up fresh tracks in my software and started improvising on the piano. The echoes continued. Once in a while, an extra note came through, but it never felt hostile. It felt like someone was adding small accents to my playing. I tried to stay calm and keep my hands steady. My fingers trembled at first, but I managed to record a long take. During playback, I heard the presence more clearly. There were times it matched my chords with subtle harmonies or gentle drones. It never sounded chaotic. It sounded like a delicate collaboration. I stayed until the caretaker knocked on the door in the evening, reminding me it was getting late. He asked if everything was okay. I told him I was just busy recording. He nodded and walked away. I packed up my gear, except for the keyboard and a few cables. I wanted to come back the next day. I felt the tension in my muscles, but I also felt drawn to this weird connection. It was like I was discovering a hidden layer in the music. Over the following days, I kept trying to communicate with that presence. I got used to the soft knocks, the quiet hums, and the occasional piano notes. Each time I recorded, the presence seemed to add a small part to my tracks. I didn't feel threatened, but I did feel alert. My stomach churned whenever I heard something new in the playback. My heart rate jumped and my arms tingled. It was like my body was bracing for a scare, but nothing ever hurt me. I found more old compositions in the desk drawers. Each piece had sections that looked incomplete. I decided to incorporate them into my own recordings. Whenever I played those fragments, I heard more distinct responses in the room. Sometimes I caught a faint melody line that sounded like it was finishing the piece. I recorded every moment. By the end of the week, I had hours of material. I listened to it late at night with headphones. I heard slight changes in pitch, random notes, and short patterns that formed coherent phrases. I felt a shiver each time I realized these weren't accidents. It sounded like the original composer was adding the parts he never finished. I never saw any physical form. I never felt hands on my shoulders or anything. But I heard these sounds, and I felt a presence. My breath turned shallow when they occurred, and my skin prickled, but I stayed in the room. I came to accept that I was collaborating with someone who wasn't physically there. My body was on edge, but my mind was fascinated. On my last day in that studio, I decided to finalize one track that combined my style with the composer's unfinished notes. I pressed record, played the chord progression, and waited for the presence to join. One or two stray notes came in. I kept playing. I felt sweat on my palms. My heart thumped. I felt something shift in the air behind me like a small draft. But I finished the piece without stopping. When I played it back, I heard a perfect line of piano notes in the middle of my performance, lining up with my chords. It lasted a few seconds, then faded. My chest felt tight. My eyes teared up, but I didn't cry. I just felt relieved, like I had finally captured what I came for. I saved all my recordings, packed up my instruments, and locked the studio for the last time. On the way out, I felt exhausted and wired at the same time. My hand shook as I gripped the doorknob. The hallway was still empty. The caretaker wasn't around. I walked down the stairs, hearing the creaks echo. When I reached the bottom floor, I stepped outside into the fresh air. My head was spinning with everything I had experienced. I stood on the sidewalk, feeling the warmth of the sun. My ears still buzzed with the memory of those ghostly notes. I never told anyone the full story in detail. I let them hear the final tracks, and some people noticed something unusual in the background. They asked me how I got those sounds. I just said it was the old studio's acoustics. People nodded, curious but not too suspicious. I kept the notebook and the recordings. Whenever I listen to them, I still get that tight feeling in my stomach. I remember those late nights in that worn-out room, hearing an invisible collaborator playing along with me. It was tense, unnerving, and impossible to explain in plain terms. But it changed the way I record music. It taught me that sounds can come from places we don't fully understand. And even though I felt fear, I also felt a strange gratitude. That's the story. I rented a studio in an ancient building. I captured sounds that weren't mine, and I discovered a presence that seemed to finish a composer's lost work. I never saw any ghost, but I heard something that felt real. It left me with a collection of tracks that will always remind me of that silent partnership. I still get chills when I think about it, but I guess that's what I was looking for when I walked into that old place. I wanted something different, and I got it. And that's all there is to say. I never expected an old house to make me question my own senses. But from the first week I spent in that isolated place, I noticed the faint outlines of something moving through the rooms at odd hours. My heart raced whenever I caught a quick glimpse of a silhouette near a window or a doorway. I told myself it could be a trick of the light, but the feeling never went away. I felt watched, even when I stood alone in the hallway at midnight. That sense of being followed kept me on edge, and I decided I needed answers. This is my story. I bought the house because it was cheap and had a lot of space. It stood far from any other property, surrounded by trees and wild grass. The walls looked solid from the outside, though the wood around the windows showed signs of age. The front door stuck a bit when I opened it for the first time. I liked the high ceilings and the large rooms. The floors creaked under my boots. The place smelled like dust and stale air. Some rooms had a few old pieces of furniture left behind, mostly broken chairs and rotting tables. There was a long corridor that connected the main living area to the rear section of the house. The corridor had several doors on either side, some locked, some stuck, some hanging open. When I first walked down that corridor, I heard an odd rustling sound. It seemed to come from behind a closed door on my left. I paused, waited, and listened. No more noise. I shrugged and moved on. My first night there was restless. I set up my bed in what seemed like the old master bedroom. I used a thin mattress on a wooden frame I had brought in. I left the windows open to air out the stale smell. But around 2 a.m. I woke up shivering. I heard the wind pushing the branches against the outer walls. I got up to close the windows. When I turned back to the bed, I saw a faint shape near the door. It was like someone leaning forward, maybe trying to listen. My breath caught in my throat. I switched on my flashlight, shining it toward that spot. No one stood there. I checked the hallway right after, but it was empty. I told myself I was imagining things, but my heart was pounding. My hands felt sweaty. I locked the bedroom door and tried to go back to sleep. Over the next few days, I spent time cleaning each room. I dragged out old crates and dusty furniture, piling them in the yard for disposal. While clearing out a closet in the corridor, I found a stack of old papers. Some were receipts for repairs from decades ago. Others looked like newspaper clippings. One article mentioned a local property dispute. Another referred to an individual with the same address as the house, but the print had faded. I set them aside on a table in the main living room, thinking I would look at them more closely when I had time. At first I heard small noises only at night. I assumed it was the wind or the old beams settling, but sometimes the noises had a pattern, like footsteps moving from one side of a room to the other. One evening I was in the kitchen checking the cabinets for pests. I heard clear steps above me, as if someone walked across the second floor. I grabbed a flashlight and went upstairs. I inspected each bedroom. No intruder, no animal. I stood in the second floor hallway looking around. My stomach felt tense. My arms shook a bit. The entire house was quiet. Then I heard the light knock of a door closing down the hall. I followed the sound until I reached the last door on the left. The handle looked rusted. I tried it, but it was stuck. I pushed hard and it opened with a loud creak. The room inside was empty, except for a small table against the wall. I looked behind the door. I looked under the table. Nothing. I noticed the window was open, letting in a weak breeze. I convinced myself the draft had forced the door to move. I shut the window and left. I started having trouble sleeping. One night I decided to walk around the house because I couldn't relax in bed. I moved slowly through the main hallway, guided by the moonlight coming through a few windows. I paused near the old grandfather clock in the corner, which didn't work but still had its hand stuck in place. I watched a faint silhouette glide across the corridor ahead of me. It moved from one open door to another, not making any sound. My heart rate spiked, and I gripped the flashlight. I walked forward, aimed the beam of light into the next room, and found nothing but bare walls. That's when I realized I needed to figure out what was going on. My pulse hammered in my ears. I kept thinking about that shape. It looked like a person, but I couldn't see details. In the following days, I combed through the old papers I had found. I discovered references to a previous owner named Edgar. He lived here a long time ago. The documents didn't state if he sold the house or just left. I wanted more details, so I decided to talk to my neighbors down the road. One of them, a man named Fred, said he remembered hearing stories about an individual who stayed in that house alone for a long period. Fred said he never met the man, but some people told him the occupant had a habit of wandering around the property late at night with a lantern. Another neighbor, Mary, mentioned that a few older residents in the area spoke about strange lights flickering in the windows. She also said they heard about sudden banging noises at odd hours. I pressed her for more information, but she just shrugged. She looked uneasy talking about it. I visited the local library next. I asked the librarian if there were any records about my house or its owners. She let me browse some archived documents. I found several property records and a few newspaper articles from about 50 years ago. One short piece mentioned that a reclusive man lived in the old house by the woods. It said neighbors complained about weird activity there, but no one ever proved anything. It also said that the man left town at some point, but the article didn't specify any details about where he went. I tried to see if I could find any official documents about his departure, but I came up empty. I noted all of these clues in a small notebook. Back at the house, I focused on practical solutions. I checked all the windows to see if the wind might be causing odd reflections. I replaced some broken panes and installed heavier curtains. I examined each door, tightened the hinges and tried to remove any reason for them to slam on their own. But the sightings continued. Sometimes I saw a brief movement on the staircase. Sometimes I heard the soft creak of floorboards in the middle of the night. On one occasion, I heard a sudden rasping sound coming from the room I used as my office. I burst in, switching on the overhead light. The curtains fluttered and the window was half open. The hair on my arm stood up because I remembered closing that window earlier in the evening. My body reacted with shortness of breath every time something like that happened. My hands got cold, my neck tightened. I often felt a sweat break out on my forehead. I looked for footprints or signs of an intruder, but I never found any. The dust remained undisturbed except for my own footsteps. I tried ignoring these events. I told myself it was just the house settling or that I was tired and seeing things. But each time, the feeling of being watched returned. It was a quiet pressure behind me whenever I walked from room to room. After 2 weeks of this, I decided to gather more information. I pulled out every piece of paper I had found. I went through them carefully. Some documents listed repairs to the roof, the plumbing, and the foundation. One sheet looked like part of a personal letter. The handwriting was slanted, and the ink had faded. It mentioned nights without sleep and a presence in the corridors, along with a reference to certain items locked away. The letter ended abruptly. I searched the attic for any locked boxes or trunks. I found a few crates, but they were empty except for some stained clothing. I pried open an old wooden trunk in a corner. Inside, I found a notebook with a torn cover. Most pages were missing, but a few described the writer's attempts to keep track of odd noises and sightings. I noticed a brief mention of someone appearing in the windows late at night. The writer recorded how they tried to stay awake and catch the figure, but they never succeeded. I felt anxious reading those words because they matched my experiences. I thought about leaving, but the place was mine now, and I had spent a lot of money on it. I convinced myself I could solve the mystery. Each night I tried a different approach. I set up a chair in the hallway and waited with a flashlight. I placed a small camera on a tripod near the staircase to record any movement. I also scattered a bit of flour near some doorways to see if footprints would appear. None did. I checked the camera's footage each morning. Nothing showed up, except for a slight flicker at certain times. The flicker didn't match any normal reflection, and the camera's audio track captured a faint scraping noise. It sounded like fabric brushing against wood. That discovery made me breathe faster. My stomach dropped every time I played it back. I spoke to a few more neighbors. Most had no direct knowledge of the house's past. A couple said they remembered hearing rumors about the place being haunted or disturbed. One man suggested that I might have rodents or raccoons. I thought about it but found no droppings or chewed surfaces. Another woman said she once visited the house many years ago to drop off a package, and she felt uneasy while waiting at the door. She couldn't describe exactly why. She just said the interior seemed off. I kept exploring every inch of the property. I went around the exterior with a flashlight at night, checking the eaves and the crawl spaces. I tried to see if there were any hidden entrances or secret passages. I found a small hatch near the back of the house leading to a storage area under the kitchen. Inside, I saw only dusty shelves and broken jars. At one point, I heard a faint tapping above me. I scrambled out and rushed upstairs, but found the kitchen empty. The tapping continued for a few seconds, then stopped. My tension grew. I felt like I was stuck in a cycle of hearing something, seeing a shape, and then finding no evidence. My mind started to race whenever I walked through the house after dark. If a door was slightly open, I expected a face to appear behind it. If I heard the wind, I wondered if it was someone whispering. I avoided certain areas, unless I had the lights on. My nights were spent tossing and turning or wandering the hallways until dawn. My eyes burned from lack of sleep. I drank too much coffee, which only made my nerves worse. One night, I decided I had to confront this presence more directly. I took a flashlight, a small baseball bat, and a voice recorder. My plan was to move from room to room, talk out loud, and see if anything happened. I started in the main living room. I said, "If someone's here, show yourself." Nothing. I said, "I just want to know who you are." Only silence. I listened for a few minutes. The house made its usual popping sounds, but I heard nothing else. I checked the corridor, shining my flashlight into each open door. When I reached the last door on the left, I saw it slowly closing, like someone was pushing it from inside. I rushed forward and yanked it open. The room was empty. My pulse hammered in my chest. I felt my temples throbbing. I looked around carefully, shining the flashlight in every corner. No one was there. I recorded myself describing the incident. My voice shook on playback. I saved the recording, feeling a wave of frustration. I wasn't finding answers. I was only getting more scared. I decided to return to my strategy of documents and research. I contacted the local historical society. They checked their records and told me that the original owner built the house in the late 1800s. Since then, the property changed hands a few times, but it mostly stayed empty. A clerk gave me a copy of an old property tax form with the name Edgar Harris. I recognized that first name from the documents. The clerk had no extra details about him. She only knew that taxes went unpaid for a few years, and the county seized the property. Then it passed through a couple of owners, but nobody stayed very long. I stacked all this information in my living room, trying to piece it together. Edgar Harris lived here. He wrote about a presence. He left behind partial letters and a notebook. The neighbors heard strange stories. I was experiencing the same odd sightings. None of this gave me a clear reason why these shapes kept appearing. I wondered if Edgar had uncovered something in the house. Maybe there was a secret room or hidden items. I checked every wall, tapping with a hammer to find hollow spots. I found nothing unusual. My final night of investigation, I sat in the hallway around midnight. I positioned the camera to point toward the corridor. I held the flashlight in one hand. My back ached from sitting so long, and I felt a dull tension behind my eyes. The air was still without any breeze. Then I saw movement at the far end, near the grandfather clock. It was a vague outline, like a person taking a single step forward. I aimed the flashlight and the outline vanished. My chest felt tight and my palms were damp. I stood up, walked slowly to the end of the hallway, and found nothing. The only sounds were my footsteps. I checked the camera footage afterwards. The camera showed a slight flicker of darkness in that area. No clear shape, just a quick shift in the light. I felt goosebumps on my arms. I stored that footage along with the other clips. Now, I'm still living here. The sightings haven't stopped, but I have some sense of the house's past. Someone named Edgar experienced the same events. The neighbors know bits and pieces. The documents hint at unsolved mysteries. No one has died here as far as I know, and there are no records of children living in the house. But I can't shake the feeling that something remains in the corridors, moving around at night. I keep searching for a final explanation. Sometimes I wake up at odd hours and hear a door creak open. Sometimes I stand by a window and see a shape reflected in the glass. It disappears when I turn around. Every time it happens, my stomach clenches and my legs feel heavy. But I'm determined to stay. I've become used to checking locks and windows before bed. I keep my flashlight on the nightstand. I stack the documents on a table in the living room, hoping that one day I'll figure out the missing pieces. For now, I live with the shadows that drift through this house. I watch them from a distance, always ready to see if one will finally become more than just a shape in the darkness. I have no fancy explanation or philosophy about it. I just know that something is here and it doesn't seem to want to leave. Last week I felt a chill in my stomach that I still can't shake off. I work as a conductor on a historic rail line that usually sticks to a strict schedule. We do weekend tours for visitors who like old trains and vintage stations. I never expected anything out of the ordinary. I used to go through my duties with calm steps and a clear routine. I checked tickets, guided people to their seats, and monitored the tracks. Nothing seemed unusual until that night. I saw a strange glow on the tracks and my heart thumped hard in my chest. I smelled wet metal in the air, and my uniform felt cold against my skin. The thick fog made everything feel closed in, and I noticed my breathing got faster. I gripped my flashlight, and my hand trembled. I had been wrapping up my shift at the main station. The fog had rolled in earlier that evening, and it was so dense that I could only see a few feet in front of me. My shift supervisor said the last scheduled train had left. I stood by the platform to check that all the lights were off and that no passengers had wandered off. My shoes scraped against the concrete, and the echo seemed louder than usual. My breath felt shallow, and I noticed a heaviness in my shoulders. I heard a distant rumbling on the tracks, and my gut tightened. There wasn't supposed to be any train coming at that time. I raised my flashlight and saw a beam of light cutting through the fog. I took a few steps closer. My pulse pounded in my ears. I waited for a horn, but there was no sound. The train approached without any screech of brakes or announcement. I only heard a low vibration that felt like it was creeping through my spine. I saw the outline of an engine car that looked worn, but I couldn't see the rail company's name. I felt the ground tremble under my boots, and I moved back in case something went wrong. The air tasted like iron. The train hissed to a stop at the platform, and I saw steam rising around it. My chest felt tight. The doors slid open with a smooth motion, but I didn't see anyone inside. The interior lights flickered. I hesitated for a moment, looking around to see if anyone else was there, but I was alone. I stepped onto the train because I felt a pull, like I had no choice. I kept my flashlight in my right hand, but I held it low because the train's interior lights were working, though they were dim. Inside, the seats had old upholstery with faded patterns. I touched the back of one seat, and it felt rough and slightly damp. The windows were fogged from the inside, so I couldn't see the platform. My shoes squeaked on the aisle floor. I looked from side to side, but I didn't see any passengers. I only heard a quiet humming that seemed to come from the walls. I walked toward the front of the car, checking each seat. My heart was thumping. I thought I felt a presence. I turned around fast, but there was only empty space. My throat felt dry, so I swallowed hard. I considered stepping off, but the doors closed behind me with a sudden hiss. My flashlight beam shook in my hand. Then the train started moving. I stumbled and grabbed a seat back to steady myself. My mind raced. No one had sounded a departure signal. I looked out the window, but I only saw darkness and swirling fog. The overhead light flickered, and I could see my reflection in the glass. I looked pale. My uniform collar felt tight around my neck. I tried the nearest door control, but nothing happened when I pressed the button. The train picked up speed, and the hum grew louder. My heart pounded, and I felt sweat forming on my forehead. I made my way forward to the next car. I had never been on a train that moved like that without any operator in the cabin. My legs felt shaky, and my back tingled. I heard a faint clicking sound, like the train was shifting tracks. It wasn't a normal route, at least not one I recognized. I opened the door to the next car. The hinges squeaked. The lights there were a little brighter, and I saw a single figure sitting near the center, wearing a dark coat. I stopped. My stomach clenched and my hands felt cold. The person didn't look at me. He had a small suitcase on his lap and faced forward. I walked closer, clearing my throat, but he didn't move. I noticed his coat had a dated style with brass buttons. I asked if he was okay, and my voice cracked. He turned his head slowly and nodded once, then pointed toward the window. I leaned over and saw a station platform passing by. It looked like an older station with wooden beams and a single lantern. It wasn't a station I recognized from our usual route. The train didn't stop. It just kept going, and that platform disappeared into the fog. My arms felt tense, and my heart hammered against my ribs. The man in the coat stood up, still holding his suitcase. He moved toward the aisle, motioning for me to follow. I felt compelled to go behind him, so I did. My footsteps echoed. I asked him who he was, but he gave no reply. He seemed calm and determined, like he had a plan. He led me to the next car. We passed through 3 cars that looked similar: old seats, flickering lights, and no other passengers. I sensed the vibration under my feet, and it felt more intense with each passing second. I wondered if this train even ran on the same rails I knew. My head felt light and I kept swallowing because my mouth felt dry. The man stopped in front of a closed door. The sign above it was in an old style of lettering. It said, "Observation Lounge." I recognized the style from photos I'd seen in the station archives. I had never been in a lounge car like that. When he opened the door, I smelled aged leather and stale air. There were tall windows all around, but the fog outside made it impossible to see anything clearly. The man set his suitcase on a small table. He tapped the window once, then turned his gaze to me. I saw that his eyes were dark brown, and his expression was neutral. He pointed at a corner of the lounge. I followed his gesture and saw an old signboard leaning against the wall. It had station names on it, but they looked outdated. Some of them I recognized from old railroad maps, but they were no longer in use. My stomach sank, and I felt sweat on my palms. I realized this train might be traveling to stations that didn't exist in modern times. I stepped closer to the signboard. The paint was chipped. I ran my finger over one of the station names, Harlow End. I had only heard that name in a conversation with an older engineer years ago. That place had shut down decades before I was born. My hand shook. The man moved to the opposite end of the lounge. He picked up a dusty ledger. He opened it and revealed rows of dates and arrivals. I walked over and looked at the entries. They listed years I recognized from history books. My head started to ache. I flipped through a few pages, and I noticed the last entry was blank. The man tapped that blank line, then looked at me. I felt my heart racing. I felt like we had found something we weren't supposed to see. I heard the train's wheels squeal, and the entire car rattled. My legs felt weak, and I had to brace myself against a table. The train slowed down. I saw the sign outside for another station, but it didn't match anything on the current route. It looked run down, with cracked boards and a broken lamp. The man grabbed his suitcase, walked to the lounge door, and gestured for me to follow. My pulse hammered, but I trailed behind him. We stepped onto the station platform, and I felt the uneven wood under my feet. The air was cold and damp. I smelled old paint and moss. The train's engine hissed in the background, but its sound was muffled by the fog. The man walked to a bulletin board near the entrance. He pointed at a paper tacked there. I approached it and saw a schedule with dates from decades ago. My vision felt blurry for a moment. I blinked rapidly, trying to focus. I noticed footprints on the damp platform, but they didn't look fresh. I knelt down and ran my hand over them. The boards were warped and some nails stuck out. I heard a subtle cough behind me. The man stood there silent, but his eyes were fixed on me. He gestured toward the train like he wanted me to get back on. I felt a surge of fear because I didn't understand what was happening. My mind raced with questions about time and reality, but I forced myself to stay calm. I followed him back onto the same car we came from. The door sealed behind us with a sharp clang. We returned to the lounge and he opened the ledger again. He took a pen from his coat pocket. He wrote something on the blank line. I leaned in to read it. Arrival. He left the date space empty, then looked at me and placed the pen in my hand. I felt a shiver in my entire arm. I didn't know what to write. My breath came in quick bursts. My mind was blank. He closed the ledger before I could react and slid it onto a table. Then he pointed at the door leading back to the rest of the train. I felt a sudden lurch as the train started moving again. I almost lost my balance. I stepped into the aisle, feeling sweat trickle down my back. The overhead lights flickered again. I called out to the man, but I didn't hear his footsteps. I turned around and he was gone. I checked the lounge, but it was empty. That made my stomach twist. I stumbled toward the front of the train, holding onto seatbacks for support. My breathing was shallow and my throat felt tight. The vibration under my feet got stronger, and I could sense the train picking up speed. I fought the urge to panic. I needed to find the front car and see if I could stop this thing. When I reached the front car, I saw an old-fashioned control panel with levers and dials. They looked functional, but there was no one in the operator's seat. I swallowed hard and approached the controls. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the main lever. My mind told me to try pulling it back. I gave it a firm tug, and I felt a rumble. The train started to slow down. and the hum in the cabin got quieter. I spotted a large gauge reading that I didn't recognize. The needle flickered between markings that didn't match the normal speed indicators. I pulled another lever, hoping I could bring the train to a complete stop. Finally, I felt the brakes engage. The train hissed and shuddered, and then I heard a loud clang. The train halted. I braced for any jolt, but it was a smooth stop. My heart thumped, and sweat slid down my temple. I stood there for a moment, listening to my own breathing. Then I moved to the door and pressed the exit button. This time the door responded. I stepped out and found myself at the main station platform, the one where I had started. The fog was still thick, but I recognized the modern sign overhead. The lampposts were the ones we usually had with normal LED bulbs. My knees felt weak, and I leaned against a metal pillar to catch my breath. I looked back at the train. It looked like the same carriage I'd seen every day, not the old weathered one I had been inside moments earlier. I stepped toward it, but the doors closed and the lights inside turned off. My flashlight beam revealed the paint job we normally have on our tourist train. That older style wasn't there anymore. I pressed my hand against the metal, feeling its cold surface. My mind raced with questions. I had just spent time on a train that didn't match our usual schedule or our usual reality. I took a step back and stared at the engine, but nothing else changed. The fog started to clear a bit, and I could see the outline of the station gates. I reached for my phone, but my hand shook too much to dial anyone. I took several deep breaths, trying to steady myself. I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around fast, gripping my flashlight. It was my supervisor walking over with a confused expression. He asked if I was okay. He said he'd been calling my name. I stared at him, unsure of how to explain what happened. My heart still pounded. I wiped sweat from my forehead and said I had just been checking the train. He looked at me and then at the train. He frowned and asked why I looked so pale. I didn't answer. I didn't have any words that made sense at that moment. I climbed down from the platform, heading toward the break room. My body felt like I'd run a marathon. I needed to collect my thoughts. As I walked away, I glanced back at the train. The windows were dark. The thick fog had almost disappeared. My flashlight illuminated the side of the train, revealing its normal signage. Everything looked ordinary. My supervisor followed me and kept asking if something happened. I just shrugged, feeling a dull ache in my chest. I headed inside the station and slumped into a chair. My hands were still trembling. My supervisor gave me a bottle of water, and I gulped it down. He asked if I wanted to go home. I nodded. I sat there for a few minutes, my mind spinning. Then I grabbed my bag, changed out of my uniform jacket, and left. On my way out, I paused to look at a display case in the lobby. It held old photographs of trains from different eras. One photograph showed a lounge car with the exact same style of seats I'd just seen. I felt my breath catch. My supervisor said something behind me, but I didn't process it. I stared at that photo, my stomach twisting. I couldn't deny what I'd experienced. I felt a tightness in my chest. I stepped away from the display and walked into the night. The air was cool, but it wasn't as foggy anymore. My legs felt heavy. I kept glancing back over my shoulder, half expecting to see that odd train parked somewhere nearby. But the platform was empty, and the night felt quiet. My thoughts were jumbled, and I couldn't form a clear explanation. All I knew was that I'd stepped onto a train that didn't fit our schedule. I'd seen station signs from places that shouldn't exist anymore. I'd met a man who never said a word but showed me a ledger with dates that belonged in another era. And now I was standing there wondering if it all happened or if my mind was playing tricks on me. I told myself I'd investigate. I'd check old records. I'd compare notes. But first I needed to get home, sleep, and see if I'd wake up feeling different. My heart still beat fast and my body felt tense. I clenched and unclenched my fists as I walked to my car. My thoughts circled around that silent passenger, that old lounge car, and that blank space in the ledger. My head pounded and my stomach churned. I got in my car and looked at the station one more time. Everything seemed normal. but I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was out there, something that only appears when the fog is at its thickest, running along tracks that shouldn't exist. I closed my car door, turned the key, and drove away with my hands still trembling on the steering wheel. I grip the old iron key in my hand and push open the heavy wooden door. My stomach feels tight and my heart kicks against my chest. The hinges squeak. A thick layer of dust coats the floor. The hallway stretches out in front of me, lit by weak sunlight from tall, narrow windows on the left. I can see cracks in the walls. I can smell musty air. This place isn't welcoming, but I want to see what's inside. I step in. The wood beneath my feet creaks. I inherited this old barracks from my uncle. I never knew he owned such a thing until I got the papers a few weeks ago. Now I'm here, and the silence is unsettling. I flick on my flashlight because the corners are dark. The main corridor extends at least 50 feet ahead. Dust hangs in the air, drifting across the beam of light. My pulse speeds up for no clear reason. Everything feels still, but I sense something in the atmosphere. The walls are thick. The old building smells like stale sweat and old leather. My mind starts forming questions. Who lived here? What did they do day after day? I feel a chill prickling on my arms. I tug my jacket tighter around me. I reach a wide entry hall with a tall ceiling. Cobwebs hang from rusted light fixtures. A row of old boots sits against one wall covered in dust. I move closer, bending down to see them. They're all lined up in perfect order. The soles are cracked. The leather is stiff. They look like they've been waiting for owners who never returned to claim them. I stand there for a moment, breathing shallowly, and then I keep walking. My footsteps echo across the hall. The air is stale, and my nostrils itch. I step into what appears to be a training room. The floor is scuffed. The walls have marks that look like they were made by blunt weapons or maybe wooden practice sticks. At the far end, there's a large mirror leaning against the wall. It's tilted and dirty. My flashlight's reflection is bright, almost blinding. I turn the beam away. Then I hear a faint shuffle. It sounds like fabric dragging over the floor. My breath stalls in my throat. I listen. A moment later, the sound is gone. I scan the room, sweeping my flashlight slowly. I don't see anyone, but my heart still pounds. Then I notice faint footprints in the dust. They form a trail from the doorway to the center of the room, then toward the far corner. I follow them. My chest feels tight, but I keep moving. There's a metallic smell in the air. It reminds me of old steel or iron. When I reach the corner, I see a stack of wooden rifles. They're piled in a sloppy way, as if someone dropped them there after a drill. My hand brushes over one. The wood is rough, cold, and splintered. I hear something from the corridor behind me. A shuffle, then a low scraping sound. My hands tense around the flashlight. I hurry back into the hall, shining the light in all directions. The corridor is empty, except for the dust drifting around. My mouth is dry. I remind myself that I came here to check everything and plan the restoration. I tell myself to keep going. I don't see any danger. I only feel an odd charge in the air. I explore a few more rooms. Most are small, with bunk beds and old metal lockers. Inside the lockers, I see uniforms in disarray. They're moth-eaten and discolored. A faint odor of decay lingers in there. I lift one uniform top. A name tag is stitched on it. The letters have faded, and I can't read them. I set it back and close the locker. The clank of the metal door echoes in the emptiness. On the second floor, I find a long corridor with windows on one side and doors on the other. Some doors are locked, so I make mental notes to bring better tools later. At the far end, I discover a large room with benches along the walls. There's a chalkboard on one side with smeared writing. The words look like instructions for drills. I step closer to read them. I can make out formation at dawn, inspection at 600, and maintenance of gear. The rest is too blurred to read. My throat feels tight again. It's as if I'm looking into someone else's strict routine. I wonder if they ever had any relief or days off. I hear a sudden commotion. It sounds like the scrape of boots on the floor and quick commands barked in low voices. The hair on my neck stands up. I spin around, shining my flashlight, but I see nothing. My ears ring a little from the tension. My forehead feels damp with sweat. The command sounded urgent, but I couldn't catch any exact words. It was more like the harsh tone of authority. Then it fades, and all I can hear is my own breathing. I feel my legs shake. I step out of that room, back into the corridor. My shoulders feel tense, my heart is pounding. I try to calm down. I'm not in danger, I tell myself. Whatever's here doesn't mean harm. But something is replaying in these walls. It's like the past is stuck in an endless routine. That's the best way I can describe it. I can't think of any elaborate explanation. I just sense it, physically, like a vibration under my skin. I decide to explore the basement. The door is stiff, but I force it open. The stairs are narrow and made of concrete. The smell of damp earth hits me and my stomach twists a bit. I hold the flashlight forward and descend one step at a time. My shoes scuff on the rough surface. When I reach the bottom, I find a wide underground corridor. The ceiling is low and the walls are thick stone. Water drips somewhere. The floor is cold under my feet and the air is heavy. My hands feel clammy, and I swallow hard. The darkness is complete except for my flashlight's beam. I check the first room on the left. It's filled with crates and old metal trunks. I pry one open. Inside, I find old training manuals, some personal items like combs and canteens, and a few battered notebooks. I flick through one notebook. The handwriting is tight, the ink faded. The date on the first page reads something from decades ago. It outlines daily routines, times for target practice, times for cleaning rifles. I see mention of an upcoming inspection. It's all very dry. I set the notebook back. My hands are shaky, so I wipe them on my pants. I hear a low rumble from outside the room. Maybe it's just the building settling. It makes my chest tighten again. I keep moving through the basement corridor. My flashlight lands on a door that's slightly ajar. Inside is a small office with a metal desk and a single chair. There's a faint smell of old cigarettes. I step up to the desk and open its drawers. I find a small ring of keys in one drawer. One of them has a label reading Archive. My pulse jumps. An archive might explain more about this place. I pocket the keys, then I notice a photograph on the desk, framed in cheap metal. It shows a group of soldiers standing in formation. Their faces look grim, their uniforms crisp. I stare at each face, trying to see if there's something unique. They all look young. They all look focused. No one smiles. A loud thud from above jolts me. It sounds like a heavy door slamming. I grip the desk for a second, heart racing. The noise resonates through the stone walls. I rush back into the corridor, shining my flashlight toward the stairwell. I see nothing, but I can still feel the vibration in my chest. I climb back up, pausing at each step to listen. My joints feel stiff. My breathing is shaky. Eventually, I reach the ground floor again. The hallway is exactly as I left it, with dust swirling in the flashlight beam. I walk back to the main entry hall and push open a pair of tall double doors. They lead to what must have been a mess hall. Long tables fill the space. Wooden benches are overturned in some places. At the front, there's a serving counter with a hinged flap. I see old utensils scattered around. Everything is coated in dust. My flashlight catches something reflective on one of the tables. It's a stray dog tag lying there, the chain coiled. I move closer, picking it up. The text is worn down, almost unreadable. I can make out part of a name, but not the full thing. I set it back. While standing in the mess hall, I hear a low murmur, like distant conversation. It's too quiet to make out words. My palms sweat. I walk slowly toward the serving counter. My flashlight beam catches faint silhouettes across the room. For a split second, it looks like figures in uniform sitting at a table. I blink and it's just empty benches again. My chest tightens. I hold the flashlight steady, but my hand keeps trembling. The feeling in the room is heavy. My senses tell me there are people here, but my eyes show me only dust and old wood. I step behind the serving counter to see if there's anything else. The pantry door is slightly open. Inside, I see broken jars and cracked plates. A wave of stale air hits me. I move back out. My mouth feels dry and my throat tight. I realize I need fresh air. I head back to the main entrance, push open the door, and step outside. The sunlight feels harsh on my eyes. My lungs fill with fresh air, and I take a moment to calm my shaking hands. I walk around the side of the barracks looking at the exterior. The building is old, with stone walls and narrow windows. The roof looks sturdy, but there are patches of missing shingles. I jot down some notes on a small pad I brought. I write down details for the restoration, new windows, roof repairs, structural checks, and so on. My handwriting is uneven because my hands still feel unsteady. After I catch my breath, I decide to go back in. I don't want to leave everything half explored. I re-enter through a side door near what looks like an old armory. The door opens into a small corridor. At the end, I find a heavy metal door labeled weapons. It's locked, so I try the keys I found in the basement. After a few attempts, one key turns the lock. The door groans as it opens. Inside, I see empty racks that probably once held rifles. There's a shelf with old cleaning kits and a few battered ammo boxes. The smell of gun oil lingers, even after all these years. I run my fingers over the empty racks. My fingertips pick up dust and something that feels like dried grease. In the corner, I spot a closed cabinet. I turn the handle and it's unlocked. Inside, there are old papers with columns of numbers, dates, and signatures. They look like inventory logs. Most lines show returns, checkouts, daily counts of rounds. The handwriting changes from one page to another, suggesting different people took turns logging data. I can almost imagine them standing here each day, updating these lists. I close the cabinet. My stomach feels hollow. There's no direct threat in this place, but the silence and the sense of old routines press on me. I leave the armory and move upstairs again, searching for the archive room. I try each door with the set of keys until I find one that clicks. This door leads to a windowless space smaller than I expected. Shelves line every wall, and they're filled with binders, boxes, and folders. The smell of old paper and dust is heavy. I run my flashlight across the labels. Some are training schedules, some are disciplinary records, and some are personal files. I pull down a random file. It contains typed pages describing physical test results, daily conduct evaluations, and notes from commanding officers. The language is blunt and formal. No personal stories, just data. I flip through several more files. The pattern is the same: names, ranks, test scores, tasks. Everything is focused on discipline, on meeting standards, on perfect attendance for drills. I don't see references to combat missions. It seems like this barracks was more of a training facility. I set the files back, then notice a locked steel drawer in a corner desk. I try a few more keys. The drawer opens with a loud click. Inside are more photos, a few letters, and some typed memoranda. My eyes skim a letter that mentions extended training sessions running late into the night. The text says something about maintaining readiness. It's signed by a commanding officer whose name I can't fully decipher. The signature is messy. As I stand there, I hear a faint marching rhythm in the hallway. The floorboards creak in a steady pattern. Step, 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 step. My chest clenches. I freeze, listening. The sound comes closer. I flick off my flashlight to see if there's any other source of light. Everything goes dark. The marching continues for a few seconds. Then it stops right outside the door. My heart thumps. I feel the pulse in my neck. I wait, silent, bracing for something, but nothing happens. After a moment, the floorboards groan as though someone is moving away. I stay still, my breath shaky. Then I turn the flashlight back on. The corridor outside is empty when I open the door. My palms are sweaty and my knees feel stiff. I walk down the corridor again, checking the time on my phone. I realize I've spent hours in here. I feel hungry and thirsty. My throat is parched. I decide I should wrap up for the day and get back to my truck. As I pass one of the bunk rooms, I catch a glimpse of movement inside. It's just a flicker, like a shadow crossing my path. My heart lurches. I shine my flashlight but see nothing except old beds and lockers. I exhale, then keep going. Back in the main hall, I pause near the row of boots. I feel a strange compulsion to line them up neatly, even though they're already in a near-perfect row. My hand twitches at my side. I don't do it. I realize something in this building wants everything orderly. There's no threat, but there's an urge to maintain discipline. I sense it in my body, like an itch to follow a routine. I head to the door, my footsteps echoing again. Outside, the late afternoon sun is low in the sky. My truck is parked at the edge of the overgrown lot. I step onto the gravel. My shoulders relax a bit. I look back at the barracks. It's big, silent, and solemn. I know I have a lot of work ahead to restore it. I also know there's some kind of presence inside replaying old drills and routines. It's not violent. It's not out for blood. It's just there, repeating, echoing. I unlock my truck and toss my flashlight onto the passenger seat. My hands are covered in dust and sweat. I wipe them on a rag I keep in the cab. My stomach rumbles. My throat still feels dry. I pull out a water bottle and take several long gulps. The cold water soothes my throat. I climb into the driver's seat and start the engine. The vibration of the truck helps steady my nerves. As I drive away, I glance at the barracks in my rearview mirror. It stands there, silent against the fading sky. My mind is full of questions. Who were those soldiers? Why does their presence linger? I don't have answers yet, but I want to learn more. Tomorrow I'll come back with better flashlights, some tools, and a plan to open those locked doors. I'll search every room. I'll read more of those files. I'll figure out what happened here and how it can stay so charged with old energy. For now, though, I just need some rest. My chest still feels tight. My body is tired. I can still hear faint echoes of boots on hardwood floors in my head, but I know I'm alone on the road. There's no one else around, just me and the sound of the engine. I arrive at my small motel room. I park, step out, and shut the door behind me. The night is quiet. I unlock the room, drop my bag on the floor, and sit on the edge of the bed. My legs ache. My head throbs. I pull off my jacket and stare at the wall for a moment. My heart rate slowly returns to normal. Then I open my phone and start typing some notes. I write about the apparitions, the sounds, the files, the leftover gear. I keep it factual. Each location, each clue. I don't add any speculation. I just want to remember everything clearly. I finish writing, set the phone down, and close my eyes. My mind keeps drifting back to that corridor and the sound of those footsteps. Even though I'm drained, I can't fully relax. My muscles are tense, and my shoulders feel like they're locked in place. I force myself to breathe slower. I remind myself that nothing tried to harm me. It was just like I stumbled onto a loop that won't stop. It's as if the past is stuck to those walls, replaying duties and training sessions. I'll uncover what I can and make sure the building is safe for restoration. I'll replace broken windows, fix the roof, and see if anything structural needs reinforcement. I'll also keep an eye out for more signs of these old soldiers. Maybe I'll figure out what they left behind besides scuffed floors and broken crates. I decide to take a quick shower. The hot water helps loosen my muscles. I scrub the dust and sweat off, feeling each knot in my shoulders. I dry off, then fall into bed. I stare at the ceiling for a while, listening to the hum of the motel's air conditioner. My eyes feel heavy. My chest is still a bit tight, but it's getting better. Tomorrow I'll return. Tomorrow I'll keep digging. I don't know if I'll ever find a definitive reason for these apparitions, but I plan to gather every trace of history I can. I want to respect this place. I want to know why it's so charged with discipline and routine. I close my eyes, forcing my mind to quiet down. My breathing slows and my body sinks into the bed. In the darkness behind my eyelids, I still see flashes of that hallway and those fading footprints in the dust. But I'm determined. I'll handle it. There's no threat, just echoes. That's what I tell myself. And for now, that's enough. I'm done for today. I let myself drift, still feeling the weight of that old barracks pressing on my thoughts. My heartbeat gradually steadies, and finally, I slip into a restless sleep. I felt uneasy the moment I stepped inside the mansion. The front door was heavy, and it groaned when I pushed it open. The hallway stretched out in front of me, and the lights flickered as if the wiring couldn't keep a steady current. The silence pressed against my ears. I kept moving forward even though my hands felt cold and my heart thumped like it was trying to warn me to leave. But I wasn't about to back down. I had just inherited this place from some distant relative, and I wanted to see it for myself. I wanted to walk these rooms and find out why people always whispered about it. I had no clue what waited for me in those corridors, but I had a feeling it wouldn't let me rest. I left my suitcase by the stairs and took slow steps across the foyer. My shoes squeaked on the tiled floor. Paintings lined the walls, their frames chipped. Each canvas showed some family member, I assumed. Their expressions looked stern. I felt like they were following me with their eyes. I kept swallowing to clear the dry feeling in my throat. The air smelled stale, like old furniture and dust. I reached for the nearest light switch. The chandelier above me buzzed and cast a dim glow over the entrance. A layer of dust coated every surface, and the corners of the ceiling had spider webs. I felt my nose itch. I reached up and rubbed it. When my hand came down, I heard a whisper. It sounded faint and I couldn't make out the words, but it made the small hairs on my arms stand up. I glanced around. Nobody stood there. It was just me. I exhaled slowly and walked to the stairs. They were wide and curved, made of dark wood. The banister felt sturdy under my grip. The house was quiet, but I couldn't stop thinking about that whisper. It wasn't the normal hum of an old house settling. It was a human voice. Or maybe two. I listened for another sound, but the mansion went silent again. I decided to explore the second floor. My footsteps echoed through the space. Each door I passed had a brass handle and some decorative pattern engraved in the wood. I tried a few knobs. Most of the doors opened to dusty bedrooms. Some were empty except for a bed frame or a single chair. Others had curtains that hung in tatters. The floor creaked under me. My breathing sounded loud in my ears. I opened one door and found a study. The walls were lined with bookshelves and a massive desk sat near the window. On the desk, there was a set of old quill pens, an ink bottle, and a stack of papers. I moved closer and saw that some of the pages were letters. The paper looked yellowed and the handwriting was old-fashioned. I picked up the top one. It was addressed to someone named Evelyn from someone named James. My fingers trembled a bit because as soon as I read the names, I heard a faint sigh behind me. I swung around, but no one was there. My chest felt tight. The curtains by the window stirred, though there was no breeze. I set the letter down and left the room, shutting the door behind me. I felt like I needed to clear my head. The hallway felt colder than before. I heard a soft voice in the distance, but I couldn't tell if it was coming from another room or from inside the walls. I decided to go back downstairs for a moment. The main staircase gave me a view of the large foyer. It felt like I was standing in an abandoned theater, with empty seats all around and some presents watching. My pulse was racing. I realized I was clenching my fists, so I forced myself to relax my hands. My nerves were on edge. I found the kitchen after opening a few doors. The counters were covered in dust, and the old stove looked like it hadn't been used in decades. I leaned against the counter to steady myself. I thought I heard footsteps above me walking around slowly. My first instinct was to rush back upstairs to check. Then I decided to keep calm. This place was huge, so maybe the old wood was just creaking under its own weight. But I couldn't convince myself. My skin tingled and I felt sweat on my forehead. I reached into one of the cabinets and found a few empty jars. I also found an oil lamp in a small pantry. There was no oil in it, but it still looked functional. I carried it with me out of habit. I didn't trust the power here, and I doubted the lights would stay on for long. Then I returned to the foyer and grabbed my suitcase. I still needed to pick a room to sleep in for the night. I wasn't comfortable with the idea, but I had no other choice. It was late, and I was stuck here anyway. I climbed the stairs again and went down the right wing. At the end of that corridor, I found a bedroom that looked less dusty than the others. It had a large bed with a faded mattress, a dresser, and a closet. The windows faced the garden, and through the grime, I could see the moonlight touching the overgrown bushes. I felt a bit calmer in this space. It didn't seem as heavy. I set down my suitcase and looked around for any signs of mice or pests. The house might have been empty for years, but I didn't see droppings or anything like that. It was surprisingly clean in that sense. The bed didn't have sheets, so I laid out a blanket from my suitcase. Then I sat on the edge of the mattress and stared at the wall. My heart was still pounding. I tried to steady my breathing, focusing on the simple act of inhaling and exhaling. That was when I heard it again, those quiet whispers. It sounded like people having a conversation in low voices, maybe right outside the door. I shot up and walked to the door. I put my ear against the wood. The whispers faded. I opened the door fast and looked into the corridor. No one was there. My palms were sweaty. My arms felt weak. I had to shake my head to refocus. I decided I wasn't going to get any rest if I kept ignoring these things. I grabbed the oil lamp and went back to the study. I left the letters untouched earlier, but they were the only clues I had. I stepped into that room, turned on the light, and walked to the desk. It smelled like paper and old ink. I glanced around to make sure I was alone. Then I picked up the letters again and started to read them more carefully. There were several letters from James to Evelyn, and also from Evelyn to James. They described some relationship that seemed complicated. They didn't mention families or any official ties. They just spoke about meeting in secret, about longing, about frustrations. From what I could piece together, they were lovers who weren't supposed to be together. I saw a reference to a locked room and a promise to run away from the mansion. But the letters ended before I found out if they actually left or not. My chest tightened as I read. I could feel the tension in their words, like they were scared and also excited. I started checking the desk drawers. One was locked, and I couldn't pull it open. I rummaged through a nearby cabinet and found a small key hidden behind a set of dusty ledgers. I tried it on the drawer, and it worked. Inside, I found a small journal with a black leather cover. It belonged to Evelyn. I flipped through the pages. She described her feelings in blunt terms, saying how she couldn't see James as much as she wanted, how the mansion's atmosphere felt oppressive, and how she heard voices in the corridors whenever she thought about leaving. Her handwriting was shaky on certain entries, like her hand trembled when she wrote. The last entry mentioned a room on the 3rd floor that held something important. She wrote that it was locked and that only she and James knew the location of the key. I ran my hand over the journal's cover. I felt a chill on my neck, like a draft had slipped past me. I turned around, and the door was wide open. I had left it that way, but the corridor beyond was dark, and something felt off. My heart started racing. I could see a faint shadow shift against the far wall, but it might have been from the flickering light. I decided to check the 3rd floor. I thought maybe I'd find the room she mentioned. I made my way back to the stairs. They led up to a narrow hallway with fewer doors. The wallpaper here was peeling badly. The floor felt brittle under my feet. I tried one door, and it was stuck. I tried another, and it opened to a small attic-like space with boxes piled up. I backed out and closed it. Then I noticed a door at the very end of the hall. It had an iron padlock on it. I tested it, and it was solid. I thought about what Evelyn wrote. Only she and James knew the location of the key. I stepped back and looked around. There was a small table with a drawer next to the wall. The table was coated in dust. The drawer was unlocked, but I found nothing except a few nails and a broken candle stub. I checked under the table. Nothing there except spider webs. I felt annoyed. I was pacing in circles. Then I tried the other end of the hallway. I noticed some loose floorboards. When I pried one up, I saw a small key. It had an ornate design. My heart skipped a beat. I grabbed it and held it tight. I felt like I was in somebody else's secret place. My forehead felt clammy. The padlock clicked open with that key. I swallowed hard and pushed the door open. The room was small. It smelled musty, like old fabric. I used my phone's flashlight because the overhead bulb was dead. Inside, I saw a table against the wall with a large wooden box on top of it. The box had carvings of vines and leaves. The hinges squeaked when I lifted the lid. Inside were letters, diaries, and small keepsakes. I saw a pair of rings tied together with a ribbon. There were dried flowers and more folded notes. My hands shook as I touched them, but I kept going. I read more confessions of love between James and Evelyn. She wrote about her fear of disapproval and the pressure to keep their relationship hidden. There was a sense of urgency in the words, like they believed they were running out of time. A shuffle behind me made me nearly drop the paper. My heart pounded. I whipped around with my light. I saw a shadow move in the corner near the door. I stared and my breathing got ragged. There wasn't a figure there, but the shadow flickered like it was alive. I felt dizzy. I stepped backward and bumped the box, causing the rings to roll. I steadied myself and forced out a breath. I left the box open and walked toward the corner. The air felt heavy, like I was walking through thick humidity. I could hear that same whispering, but it was more intense. It sounded like two people speaking at once. My body felt tense. I wiped sweat off my brow. I called out, asking if anyone was there. I knew it made no sense, but I felt compelled to do it. The whispers cut off in an instant. My chest rose and fell fast. My mouth felt dry. I returned to the table and picked up the rings. I felt warmth in my hands as I held them. I read the inscription on one ring, "Forever bound." The other had the same words. I squeezed them for a moment. In my mind, I pictured James and Evelyn wanting to keep these rings safe, hidden from anyone who would separate them. The diaries and letters had the same theme, a strong bond they had to conceal. I set the rings back in the box gently. I realized my hands were trembling. I didn't want to stay in that tiny room anymore, so I closed the box, slipped it under my arm, and left. I locked the door behind me. My heart was still pumping hard, but something inside me felt a bit calmer. It was like I finally understood what those voices might be. They weren't trying to harm me. They seemed more like echoes trying to reach someone. Maybe these letters and diaries were the only way they could communicate. I didn't have proof, but that was the feeling I got. I decided to take the box downstairs to the study. My steps felt heavy, but I kept going. I placed the box on the desk, next to the old letters and diaries. My mind raced with thoughts about James and Evelyn's relationship. I wanted to do something to acknowledge it. I didn't want these secrets to rot in a dusty room anymore. They had been hidden long enough. I pulled out each letter and laid them in order, trying to piece together a timeline. I noticed that many of the messages referenced a promise to each other, something about the day they would leave the mansion behind. They talked about an item that symbolized their union. I guessed it was the rings. There was one letter I hadn't seen earlier. It was stuck between two diaries. It described a plan to present those rings to each other in front of the old oak tree in the backyard. There was a sense of hope in that letter, but no closure. I wondered if they ever got that chance. I reached for the rings again. Holding them felt strange. My throat felt tight, and my arms had goosebumps. I heard a faint voice so close I could almost believe someone was standing behind me. I turned around, and for a split second I saw a shape in the doorway. My legs nearly gave out. It vanished in an instant, like a reflection. The hush returned, and my ears were buzzing. I knew I had to do something meaningful. I took the box with me and headed outside through the back door. The yard was overgrown with weeds, but I followed a broken stone path until I saw an old oak tree. It was tall, and its branches spread out wide. The air felt damp and the wind rustled the leaves. I approached the trunk and set the box down at the base of the tree. Then I removed the rings from the box. My hands shook and my stomach fluttered with nerves, but I placed the rings in a small hollow in the trunk. I stood back and stared at them for a few seconds. My eyes stung. The air felt thick, and I had trouble breathing. I felt a sudden rush of something around me, like the wind picked up for a second. Then it calmed. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. I stood there waiting, but nothing dramatic happened. The night was still, except for the sound of the breeze through the branches. I felt an odd sense of relief, though. My shoulders weren't as tense. I looked up at the house and saw that it seemed quieter. The lights were still on, but I didn't feel those unsettling eyes on me. The windows were just windows now. When I went back inside, I noticed the corridors felt different. I didn't hear any whispers, and I didn't see any shadows flickering. The air didn't feel quite as cold. I couldn't explain it, but I sensed that something had changed. It was like James and Evelyn's secrets were out in the open. Maybe that was all that was needed. I returned to my room in the right wing. My heart was still beating fast, but I felt calmer than before. I lay on the bed listening to the house. It creaked a bit, but I didn't hear any voices. My eyes were heavy and my muscles ached from the tension of the night. I let myself sink into the mattress. Soon, I drifted off. The next morning, I woke up with stiff joints and a sore back. I washed my face in the bathroom, scrubbing away the sweat from the night before. The water pressure was weak, but enough to cool me down. When I walked back into the bedroom, I noticed how the light coming in through the window felt warmer. I opened the curtains and let the sun in. Dust motes floated around, but the room didn't feel so oppressive anymore. I thought about packing my bags and leaving that morning, but I changed my mind. I wanted to explore more, but without the fear. I spent the day cleaning and sorting through some of the rooms. I found more trinkets and old belongings, but no more locked drawers or hidden compartments. Everything felt calm. In the late afternoon, I went out to the oak tree. The rings were still there in the trunk's hollow, exactly where I had placed them. The breeze moved gently across my face. I felt a sense of acceptance. I stayed there for a few minutes, listening to the wind in the branches. I can't say I understand everything that happened in that mansion. I don't know how those whispers worked or why the shadows moved the way they did. But I believe something was lingering here, stuck in a cycle of secrecy. They wanted someone to see the truth they left behind. They needed someone to piece it together. By bringing their symbols of devotion to that oak tree, I think I gave them a chance to rest. I didn't hear the whispers anymore. The tension in the corridors vanished. The mansion was still old and worn, but it felt less like a prison and more like a house that could breathe again. I've decided to fix the place up. It'll take a lot of time and effort, but I feel some responsibility to honor what was left here. There are no more secrets in these hallways. I walk through them now without flinching at every sound. At night, the house is quiet. Sometimes a floorboard will creak, but it feels normal, not unsettling. I pass by the study and I see the diaries and letters. I keep them on a shelf now so I can look at them when I want to remember what happened. I'm still cautious. It was a frightening experience, and I'm not sure if anything else will surface. But for now, the house is at peace. And so am I. That's the story of my first night here, and how I stumbled into a past romance that demanded to be recognized. I'm not scared of it anymore. I'll stay, and I'll make this mansion a place where secrets don't linger in the walls. I hope that's what James and Evelyn wanted, and if there are still whispers here, they're quiet enough for me to live with. I still remember the moment I first walked through that front door. The wood felt damp under my hand and the hinges let out a sharp creak. I wasn't prepared for the tension that settled in my chest. My new job looked simple on paper, restore an old mansion to its original form. But I knew something else was waiting for me inside. By the end of that first evening, I had no doubt there were silent visitors roaming those halls. I arrived around noon on my first day with a toolbox in one hand and a flashlight in the other. The weather outside felt muggy. My shirt clung to my back, and I smelled a thick layer of dust the moment I crossed the threshold. The mansion's front hall had a marble floor that looked cracked in several places. Patches of grime covered the corners. I noticed frayed carpets rolled up against the walls. The owners told me to store everything in the main parlor while I worked, so I moved those carpets first. My boots dragged across the marble, making a steady scrape. I felt a cold sensation on the back of my neck, like the air refused to circulate. I tried to keep my focus on the job. I lifted my hammer and started tapping around the door frames. The wood felt soft in spots, like termites had made a home there. The hallway smelled musty, like old books left in a damp closet. While I worked, I heard faint taps somewhere deeper in the mansion. I paused and looked around. All I could see was a long corridor stretching out to the back. The light from the windows was weak, and the corners looked dark, but I sensed something watching me. I told myself it was just my nerves. Then I went back to hammering. I spent the afternoon peeling away chipped paint in the foyer. Flakes of white paint fell onto my arms and stuck to my sweaty skin. Now and then, I felt a light breeze and turned around, expecting someone behind me. But the hall stayed empty. Late in the afternoon, I forced open the big windows along the front wall. They screeched, and dust flew out, making my nose itch. I wiped my face with the back of my hand and saw a thick layer of gray residue. As evening set in, I decided to stay late and make progress. The place was large, and I wanted to get a head start. When darkness finally came, the corridor lights flickered now and then. They ran on old wiring, so it didn't surprise me. But every time they flickered, I felt a tingle in my stomach. It was hard to ignore. Around 8 p.m., I took a break and set up a small work lamp in the main parlor. I unpacked a sandwich and leaned against the wall to eat. That was the first time I caught a shape in the corner of my eye. It moved near the far doorway, almost drifting across the hall. I jerked my head and aimed my flashlight. The space was empty. I could hear my own breath and a faint crackling from the lamp. My heart pounded, but I told myself it was a shadow or the reflection of light against something metallic. I returned to my sandwich, but my appetite faded. After my break, I climbed the staircase to the second floor. Each step squeaked under my weight. The banister felt loose in places. I tested each area with my hand before I trusted my footing. On the second floor landing, I saw 3 closed doors. I opened the first and found a small library with a single window. The air was stale, and I detected a hint of mold. I went in to check the condition of the walls. There were shelves against every side filled with old hardcovers. A black armchair sat in the corner. I set my flashlight on the chair and ran my hand along the books, looking for signs of pests. The covers felt worn. Some were missing spines. A few looked water damaged. I froze when one of them slipped off the shelf on its own. It didn't fall straight down. It sort of slid out and landed with a thud at my feet. My chest tightened. I knelt and picked it up. The binding had some initials on it, but I couldn't read them easily. Then I noticed a slight breeze on the back of my neck. I spun around, expecting a window to be open, but that window was shut, and I didn't see any vent. I swallowed hard and left the library. I moved on to the next 2 rooms. They were empty bedrooms with warped floorboards. I tested each board to see how much work was needed. Each step made a soft pop. I felt anxious, but I tried to concentrate on my notes. I kept writing measurements and possible repairs. My handwriting looked shaky. I heard faint movements in the corridor. I walked out fast, shining my flashlight from one end to the other. The hallway felt colder than before. My arms tingled. It was so quiet that I heard my pulse in my ears. Then I glimpsed something near the top of the stairs. It looked like a figure with shoulders bent forward, but I couldn't see a face. I froze in place. My throat felt tight. The figure slid down the steps without a sound. I waited, counting 5 or 6 seconds, and then I followed. My pulse hammered. My legs felt heavy, but I forced myself to keep walking. When I got to the bottom, the corridor was empty again. I stood there swallowing against a dry mouth. I exhaled and decided to call it a night. I gathered my tools and locked up. Outside, I took a deep breath. The air smelled fresh compared to the stale atmosphere inside. I drove home, feeling unsettled but also curious. Something in that place wanted attention. The next morning, I showed up earlier. The sun was out, and the interior looked less intimidating. I hauled in some lumber and new materials. Then I moved a ladder into the main corridor to check the light fixtures. While I was up there unscrewing a metal plate, the old fixture rattled in my hand. Bits of rust fell onto my head. I held my breath and tried not to inhale the debris. From that vantage point, I saw an open doorway that led to a smaller sitting room. It had a few chairs covered in sheets. The dust in the air looked thicker there. I planned to go in after I finished with the fixture. About an hour later, I climbed down and headed to that sitting room. The chairs and a coffee table stood in the middle, all covered in white cloth. It felt like the owners had abandoned the space years ago. I pulled the sheets off one by one. Dust swirled around me, making me sneeze. Underneath the sheets, the chairs looked faded, but they still had some elegant carvings on the wood frames. I ran my hand over the armrest of one chair, feeling the grooves. Then I heard a distant scrape, like a chair sliding across the floor in another room. I tensed up, goosebumps rising on my arms. I kept quiet for a few seconds. The house gave no other sound. I set my jaw and returned to examining the chairs. In the next few days, I kept to a routine. I repaired woodwork, checked floorboards, and organized items that needed restoration. Each day, I felt the presence of someone else. Sometimes I smelled perfume in a hallway or heard light footsteps on the landing. Other times, I saw a soft glow move behind the door to the library. My heart always raced, but I never felt threatened. It was like these apparitions wanted me to see parts of the mansion I hadn't explored. When I walked into new rooms, I found old letters, diaries, and pieces of jewelry. I saw a ring on a dresser once, and it looked polished, as if someone had been handling it recently. These details made me cautious, but also pulled me in deeper. After a week, I decided to work some nights again because my schedule fell behind. The wiring project in the basement took longer than expected. I stood in the basement with a single lamp hanging from a hook, the glow casting shadows on the stone walls. The basement smelled damp, and puddles formed in the corners. My boots made splashes when I walked around. I fiddled with old fuse boxes and cables. The cables looked frayed, so I stripped them and set up new connectors. The repetitive task of tightening wires helped me calm down. Then I heard a gentle knock above me, like someone tapped the floor upstairs. It happened 3 times. I pushed my tools aside and listened. Another 3 knocks. My heart sped up. I felt a drop of sweat roll down my temple. I climbed the stairs and opened the door to the main hallway. That hallway was dark except for my flashlight beam. The overhead light was off. I remembered turning it on earlier, so that felt strange. I flicked the switch on the wall, but nothing happened. I checked the fuse box. It looked fine. My nerves were on edge, so I tried to keep moving. I walked to the library door and found it slightly open even though I'd left it closed. My hand trembled as I pushed it open. Inside, the lamp on the desk was on. I didn't remember leaving a lamp there at all. I stepped in. The air felt cold and still. My stomach churned. I saw someone standing at the far shelf. They looked transparent. My legs went stiff. My throat felt tight. I struggled to breathe. I watched them reach out and touch a book, then vanish. My skin prickled. I stood there, clutching my flashlight. After a few seconds, I managed to move. I walked over to that shelf. The book was slightly out of place. Its title was clear. It said something about personal correspondence. I took it out. Inside, there were letters about secret meetings, stolen kisses, and quiet walks in the mansion's garden. I flipped through them fast, my hands shaking. The text was old-fashioned, but I recognized references to a hidden door near the back of the house. Over the next few nights, I searched for that hidden door. I explored the back rooms, the closets, and the storage areas. Every time I stepped into a new space, I felt like the air shifted. My eyes darted around, scanning the walls for signs of an opening. I listened for movement behind the walls, hoping to find a hollow space. One night, I leaned against the end of the corridor on the first floor. The wallpaper there looked slightly peeled. I pressed my hand along the seam. The wall felt loose. My heart thumped in my chest and my palms turned sweaty. I slid my fingernails under the wallpaper and tugged gently. A section came off, revealing a small latch in the wood. I paused, my breath catching in my throat. I pulled the latch and a narrow door creaked open. I aimed my flashlight inside. A short passage led into a cramped room. The floor was covered in dust and broken pieces of plaster. The walls had a few shelves with boxes. I ducked inside, coughing when I disturbed the dust. The air felt thick, and the flashlight beam bounced against old trunks and crates. I opened one trunk. Inside, I found a stack of letters tied together with a ribbon. I grabbed the bundle and flipped through them. I recognized the same names from the other letters. They talked about private gatherings in the parlor and plans for future rendezvous. I felt a warmth spread through my chest, like I had uncovered something meaningful. These people had lived here with strong feelings, and their presence still clung to the walls. As I stood up, my flashlight shook in my hand. I felt someone behind me. My back tingled, and my heart hammered. I turned around slowly. There was a figure again, faint in the light. I saw the outline of an older man with a gentle posture. He raised his hand in a slow gesture, like he wanted me to follow. My instincts told me to back away, but I stayed. He pointed to another crate in the corner. Then he disappeared. I stepped toward that crate, knees feeling weak. I flipped open the lid. Inside, I found more personal belongings: an old watch, a small box of dried flowers, and a bundle of old photographs. I picked up one photograph. It showed two people standing on the mansion's front steps, smiling. I felt a wave of tension leave my body. My breathing slowed. All I heard was the rustle of papers in my hands. I climbed out of that hidden room and closed the latch behind me. My mind was racing, but I wasn't terrified anymore. I felt alert and calm at the same time. I went to the main parlor, spread out the items on a table, and examined everything. There was no sense of danger in any of this. Instead, it felt like the house wanted me to see these stories and preserve them somehow. I spent hours sorting through letters, trying to piece together a timeline. I turned each page carefully, making sure not to tear the fragile paper. Occasionally, I heard soft footsteps behind me or sensed a presence in the doorway, but I didn't panic. I felt like I had silent companions guiding me. In the following days, as I continued the restoration, I found more objects. I discovered old table linens embroidered with initials that matched the letters, silverware sets stored in the cabinets, and hidden compartments in the fireplace mantel. Each discovery helped me understand how these people lived. At night, I sometimes saw outlines near the windows or heard faint voices that faded before I could make out words. My chest would tighten, but then I'd relax because they never seemed hostile. One evening, I decided to sit in the main parlor with the lights dimmed. I had finished repairing some furniture and patching walls. I wanted to rest. While I sat on a restored chair, I noticed a figure pass by the open doors. My body tensed, but I rose to follow. I walked into the corridor, and this figure led me toward the staircase. It wasn't a clear person, just a pale glow. It drifted upstairs. I climbed after it, holding the banister. My hands felt cold. The corridor on the second floor was dark, but I saw the glow enter the first door on the right. That was the room with the library. When I got inside, it was gone. The library looked normal, except for the faint hum of energy. I felt it in my fingertips. The air was still. I lingered there for a while, listening. My heart beat in a steady rhythm. After a moment, I said out loud, "I hear you." My voice echoed softly. Nothing responded, but I felt less alone. As the restoration neared completion, the house looked brighter. The floors shone with new polish. The walls had fresh paint. The rooms felt ready for visitors. Each time I walked through the mansion, I sensed gratitude around me. The footsteps at night became less frequent and the lights stopped flickering. I still caught glimpses of figures in the corners, but I no longer jumped or shivered. I acknowledged them and moved on with my tasks. The tension in my body eased over time. My shoulders stayed relaxed and my breathing felt steady. When I finally reached the last day of work, I locked up my tools in the back of my pickup. The sun was setting, and the front hall looked welcoming. The new paint smelled crisp and the floors reflected the soft glow of the overhead lights. I walked through each room, turning off lamps and checking that all windows were secure. In the library, I glanced at the shelves one more time. The books remained in place, the hidden story revealed. I turned off the lamp on the desk and stepped out. In the corridor, I felt a cool breeze brush against my arm. I stopped, closed my eyes for a second, and let out a breath. Then I went outside. I shut the main doors, listening to the lock click. It felt final. Standing on the porch, I glanced back at the mansion. The old walls and windows looked steady, ready for the next phase. My heartbeat was calm. I knew the silent figures might still roam those corridors at night, passing along their memories to anyone who paid attention. I felt a sense of respect for them. They hadn't scared me away. They had shown me the depths of that place in a way I never expected. I walked down the steps and headed to my truck. My work was done. I felt the weight of the keys in my pocket, a reminder of the journey. As I drove off, I felt certain that those halls would remain alive with the echoes of the past, and I had been a part of it. I never expected to find a hidden gate in the middle of a narrow alley. I was just looking for some quiet place to clear my head. But I stumbled onto something strange that changed the way I see these old streets. I'm going to tell you exactly what happened, step by step, without fancy words or hidden meanings. I'm still trying to understand it myself, so I'll explain it the way I lived it. I left my apartment close to midnight. I had spent most of the evening pacing around my living room, feeling restless. I decided to go for a walk to calm down. The weather was cool, and the air smelled a bit damp. I passed by a few closed shops, their shutters down. I heard my footsteps on the uneven cobblestones, and the faint echo of distant cars on bigger streets nearby. Most streetlights gave off a dull yellow glow, and a few of them flickered. The city's older section always felt a bit isolated at that hour. I turned a corner and walked into an alley I'd never noticed before. It had high walls made of worn brick. I saw a couple of iron lanterns attached to those walls. They weren't lit, but I could see chipped paint on them. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I noticed a short flight of steps that led down to an even narrower pathway. I felt uneasy, but I kept moving. My chest felt tight. I reached into my jacket pocket to make sure I had my phone, even though the battery was low. I tried to switch on the flashlight. It was weak, but it still helped me see a few steps ahead. I remember hearing a sudden scraping noise nearby. It sounded like metal against stone. I stopped and listened, but it faded. My heart started beating faster. I kept looking around, trying to figure out if there was someone else in the alley. I couldn't see any movement, so I took a few more steps. Then I saw it, a tall, ornate gate tucked away behind a stack of old crates. The gate had a pattern of swirling lines, and it looked like it was made of dark iron. It had a lock, but it was hanging loose, open as if someone had left it that way. My first thought was to turn around and leave, but curiosity got the better of me. I pushed the crates aside. My hands felt grimy after touching them. They smelled like rotting wood and damp cardboard. Then I pressed on the gate. It swung inward with a low creak. I walked through and found myself in a different kind of space. The air felt heavier and the temperature dropped. I got goosebumps on my arms. My breath felt shallow for a moment and I swallowed hard. There was a courtyard with stone tiles. Some of them were loose and I had to watch my steps so I wouldn't trip. The walls around me were high, but I could see the sky above. It was dark with a few faint stars. A single lantern on a distant wall was lit. It cast a weak light over a set of steps that went even deeper into some hidden part of the city's old district. I noticed a low hum, like a breeze passing through a narrow space. I moved toward that sound, and I felt a rush of cool air against my face. I heard another sound to my left, like someone shuffling feet. I turned quickly, but I didn't see anyone. I stood still for a few seconds. My pulse was racing. My hands felt clammy, and I almost dropped my phone. I pointed its dim flashlight around me. At first, I saw only old walls and a few wooden doors. Then I caught a glimpse of a faint figure. It stood near a corner of the courtyard. My first instinct was to back away, but I stayed where I was. The figure looked almost transparent. I felt my mouth go dry. The figure had the outline of a person in some old-fashioned clothing. I could see the shape of a long coat and some kind of hat. It didn't move for a moment. I heard my own breathing loud in my ears. Then I saw its head turn in my direction. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest so hard that I felt like it was shaking my entire body. I wanted to speak, but my throat felt tight. The figure lifted an arm, almost like it was beckoning me. I didn't sense hostility, but I felt a surge of fear. My stomach churned and my knees felt weak. I took a step forward. The figure backed away through a doorway that I hadn't noticed. It was a small wooden door set into the wall. I decided to follow because I wanted to understand what I was seeing. My steps were slow, my legs felt tense, and my shoulders were stiff. I pushed the door open. It creaked, and the sound echoed in the darkness. Beyond the door, there was a narrow corridor lit by a flickering lantern on a chain. The flame was weak, and it cast jumping shadows across the corridor walls. The figure stood at the end of the corridor, near another archway. I could see the old coat more clearly. The fabric looked rough and the hat had a wide brim. I heard a faint whisper, but I couldn't make out words. I tried to say something, but all I managed was a forced whisper that sounded shaky to my own ears. I took a few more steps. I heard my shoes scraping on the stone floor. The figure turned and moved through the archway. I had no idea what I would find on the other side, but I followed. I found myself in a room that looked like a small chapel. There were wooden benches lined up in rows. They were covered in dust and spiderwebs. A few candles sat on a stone altar, but they were unlit. My flashlight caught a glimpse of something carved into the walls. They were symbols, but I couldn't understand them. I didn't see the figure at first. I walked between the benches, checking each row. I heard a slow rustling sound behind me. I spun around. The figure was standing on the other side of the altar. It was looking at me, even though it had no clear face. I felt a knot in my stomach. A soft light appeared on the wall behind the figure. It formed a pattern of letters that I didn't recognize. They glowed with a pale tint. My mind was racing. I wasn't sure if I was imagining it, but I could read part of it. It felt more like a puzzle than normal writing. I took a few steps toward it, but my legs felt shaky. I wanted to get a closer look. I stood right in front of the altar. The figure reached out a hand, palm up. My chest tightened, but I placed my hand over that ghostly outline. I felt a slight chill pass through my arm. It made me gasp. When I looked at the wall again, the letters shifted. They almost looked like instructions. I saw simple words: seek, hear, gather, mixed with symbols. I felt a drop of sweat roll down my temple. I wiped it away. My head was buzzing with questions. I whispered, "What does this mean?" The figure slowly pointed toward a side door in the chapel. I turned my head to look at it. When I looked back at the figure, it was gone. I felt an odd emptiness in my stomach. I hurried to that side door, feeling like something was pushing me forward. I opened it and found a set of spiral stairs leading downward. My shoes tapped on the old steps, and each step made a dull echo. The walls were damp. I ran my hand along the surface to keep my balance. The air smelled musty like a cellar. My heart pounded and my mouth felt dry. I tried to stay quiet, but I was breathing hard. I could see a faint light at the bottom of the stairs, so I followed it. I emerged into a passage lined with small arches. Each arch had some kind of engraved plaque. I saw more symbols and a few words in old script. Some looked worn and unreadable. Others had phrases in a language I didn't recognize. Every few steps I heard a soft whisper, but I couldn't see anyone. At one point I glanced behind me and saw a different figure. This one was taller and seemed to